Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The Haunting Apartment in Chicago. They say a change of scenery helps heal a broken heart. That's what I told myself as I lugged my last box into the dusty, old apartment in Chicago. It wasn't much to look at: creaky wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and a faint musty smell that clung to the air like a bad memory. But it was mine, and for the first time in years, I was alone. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Even in the middle of the city, where noise never truly stops, there was an unnatural stillness. The kind that makes your ears strain for a sound, any sound, just to fill the void. I tried to shrug it off as exhaustion and began unpacking. But as I worked, strange details about the apartment caught my attention. The shadows seemed darker than they should have been, pooling in corners as if they were alive. A faint draft came from nowhere, carrying with it the faint scent of something sweet, almost like flowers left to decay. Then there were the windows. Despite their age, they were spotless, but the view outside seemed wrong. The streetlights cast odd, flickering shadows that didn't match the objects on the sidewalk. I told myself it was my imagination, fueled by the stress of the move and the lingering ache of my recent breakup. By the time I crawled into bed, I was too tired to care. But even as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment was watching me. They say heartbreak calls for drastic measures. For me, it was moving to a new city and starting fresh. The apartment in Chicago was everything I could afford: a creaky one-bedroom in a building older than the skyline itself. The landlord had been eager to lease it, too eager. He barely made eye contact as he handed me the keys, muttering something about its unique charm. When I first stepped inside, the air felt different, heavier somehow. The walls seemed to lean inward, as though the apartment was holding its breath. The hardwood floors groaned under my weight with every step, their sound echoing faintly, though I couldn't tell why. The place was empty, yet it felt occupied. Unpacking was meant to be a distraction. Box after box, I tried to fill the space with my things, make it feel like home. But no matter how hard I tried, the apartment resisted. The walls remained cold to the touch, the lighting dim even with every bulb blazing. Strange details began to pile up, little things I couldn't explain. The faint draft that whispered through the apartment wasn't from the windows, which I checked twice to make sure they were shut tight. It smelled sweet and cloying, like overripe flowers left too long in a vase. Then there was the wallpaper. At first glance, it looked like any other dated pattern, faded swirls of beige and green. But as I stared longer, the shapes seemed to twist and shift, forming patterns that weren't there before. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, darker and denser than shadows had any right to be. The final straw came when I noticed the locked door. Tucked away at the end of the narrow hallway, it was small and nondescript, easily overlooked. But the brass knob was polished, spotless, as though someone had been using it, though no one had lived here for years, according to the landlord. I told myself it was nothing. An old building creaks, drafts form, and shadows play tricks on tired eyes. But when night fell, the unease didn't leave. It grew. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that was too perfect, too complete. And just as I began to drift off, a faint noise reached my ears. It was soft, distant, and unmistakable. Someone was sobbing. The next morning, I decided to explore the neighborhood. Coffee shops, old brick buildings, and narrow streets, it had the charm I hoped for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that people were avoiding my gaze. A few smiled politely, but their expressions quickly turned neutral, as if they didn't want to linger on me for too long. Back at the building, I ran into a neighbor, a wiry, middle-aged man in a worn Cubs cap, just as he was fumbling with his keys. His apartment was right across from mine. "New here?" he asked, his tone friendly but guarded. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Moved in yesterday." "Which unit?" 402. His face stiffened. The smile disappeared, replaced by a frown so deep it looked carved into his features. "Oh," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "That one. What about it?" I pressed, trying to keep my voice light. He hesitated, glancing toward my door as if expecting it to swing open on its own. "It's an old building," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "Lots of history. People come and go." His vague answer only made me more curious. "What kind of history?" He sighed, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't want to spook you or anything, but that unit's had incidents. Strange things. Folks who live there don't usually stay long." "Like what?" I asked, leaning in slightly. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uneasy. "You ever hear about the girl? Lived there back in the 80s. Nice kid, quiet. Then one day, poof, vanished. Left everything behind. Cops didn't find much, just some weird stuff in her apartment." "Weird stuff?" I echoed. "Notes, scratches on the walls, and, well, rumors. People said she wasn't alone in there." He shot me a look that sent a chill down my spine. "But you know how people are. They make up stories." The way he said it made it clear he believed every word. I laughed nervously, hoping to lighten the mood. "Well, thanks for the heads up." "Sure." He turned to his door but paused before going inside. "If you hear anything strange, don't ignore it." Then he disappeared into his apartment, leaving me standing alone in the hallway. That night, the apartment felt even quieter than before. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop hearing his words in my head. "If you hear anything strange, don't ignore it." The sobbing returned, faint but unmistakable. That night, the apartment was colder than usual. The heating worked fine during the day, but as the city outside settled into its nightly rhythm, an icy chill crept through the rooms. I bundled myself in a blanket, convincing myself it was just the old building's quirks. By midnight, I was drifting in and out of sleep, still uneasy from the conversation with the neighbor. His words lingered, swirling in my mind like a warning. My dreams were fragmented, images of locked doors, empty hallways, and flickering shadows. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was part of the dream, a soft, mournful sound, almost rhythmic in its sorrow. It pulled me out of sleep, my body jolting awake as my ears strained to catch it. There it was again, a faint sobbing, muffled yet distinct, as if someone was crying far off in another room. I sat up in bed, the cold air biting at my skin. The sound was steady now, unchanging, like a looped recording. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "It's just the neighbors," I whispered to myself, but I wasn't sure I believed it. Maybe someone upstairs was having a rough night, or maybe the sound was traveling oddly through the walls. I clung to that explanation as I got up and moved to the door of my bedroom. The hallway beyond was dark, the faint glow of the city barely filtering through the apartment's old windows. I stepped closer to the sound, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't coming from outside. It was here, inside my apartment. I froze, debating whether to investigate further. The sobbing wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Slow, aching, filled with a grief so heavy it made my throat tighten. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. Silence answered me. The sobbing stopped abruptly, leaving a void that felt louder than the sound itself. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the apartment remained still, the silence pressing against me like a weight. Finally, I shook my head, laughing nervously at myself. "I'm just tired," I muttered, retreating to my bed. It's been a long day. Exhaustion messes with your head. But even as I lay back down, pulling the blanket tight around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had heard me. Something was waiting. The next day, I tried to shake off the strange events of the night. I told myself it was just the stress of moving and lack of sleep. Still, the memory of the sobbing lingered, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to catch a glimpse of something or someone behind me. I busied myself with more unpacking, determined to make the apartment feel normal. As I sorted through a box of kitchen supplies, my eyes wandered to the far end of the hallway. There it was, the door I hadn't paid much attention to before. It looked ordinary enough, painted the same dull white as the rest of the apartment. But something about it felt off. Unlike the other doors, this one had no scuffs or signs of wear. The brass knob gleamed as though it had been polished recently, yet I knew I hadn't touched it. I approached it slowly, my footsteps echoing faintly on the hardwood floor. The closer I got, the colder the air seemed to become. A faint draft seeped through the edges of the frame, carrying with it that same sickly sweet scent I noticed before, like decaying flowers. When I reached for the knob, my hand hesitated midair. A deep unease churned in my gut, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity had a pull all its own, and despite my better judgment, I grasped the handle and gave it a gentle twist. It didn't budge. Locked. I exhaled, a strange mixture of relief and frustration washing over me. Figures, I muttered under my breath. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what lay behind it. Another storage closet? An unused room? For a moment, I considered calling the landlord to ask for the key, but something stopped me. I didn't want to draw attention to it, not yet. Some part of me felt that opening that door would invite more than I was prepared to handle. Instead, I backed away, telling myself it wasn't worth worrying about. But as I turned to leave, a soft sound stopped me in my tracks. A faint, almost imperceptible click, like the sound of a lock being tested from the other side. I spun around, heart pounding, but the door remained still. No movement, no sound. Just the same cold draft and the gleaming brass knob staring back at me. Old buildings make noise, I whispered to myself, retreating to the safety of the living room. But the sense of unease clung to me for the rest of the day, and no matter how much I tried to focus on other things, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. The night felt heavier than usual. The air in the apartment was thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. I double-checked the windows before bed, making sure they were locked, and shoved a chair under the doorknob of the front door for good measure. Paranoia, I told myself. Just nerves. Sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, haunted by fragments of dreams I couldn't quite remember. The sound of sobbing still lingered at the edges of my mind, though the apartment was silent. Or perhaps I was too afraid to truly listen. When I finally drifted off, my sleep was restless, filled with an oppressive darkness that pressed against me. I woke up suddenly, heart racing, drenched in cold sweat. It took a moment to realize where I was. The dim light of the street lamps outside filtered weakly through the curtains, painting the room in pale, ghostly hues. That's when I felt it, a dull, throbbing ache in my arms and legs. I threw back the blanket and froze. Bruises. Dark, shadowy blotches marred my skin, as if someone had gripped me tightly. My wrists bore the worst of it, encircled by purplish marks that looked disturbingly like fingers. I stared at them in disbelief, my mind racing for an explanation. Had I hit something in my sleep? Tossed and turned so violently that I'd bruised myself? The possibility felt absurd, but I clung to it anyway. The cold draft swept through the room again, raising goosebumps on my skin. That scent of rotting flowers was stronger now, clinging to the air like a warning. I glanced toward the hallway, half expecting to see something lurking there, but it was empty. As I stood to turn on the light, my legs buckled slightly, but bruises flaring with pain. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached for my phone, desperate for some sense of normalcy. The screen's glow lit up the room, but there were no messages, no missed calls, just the time staring back at me, 3:33 a.m. I shivered, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The silence was deafening now, so heavy it seemed to press against my ears. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, I heard it again. A sob. This time, it wasn't distant. It was closer. Inside the room. I spun around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering in my chest. The sobbing stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the sound of my own shallow breathing. I collapsed back onto the bed, my body trembling, my mind grasping at explanations. Exhaustion. Stress. Anything but the truth that was clawing its way into my thoughts. I wasn't alone in the apartment. The sobbing became my new reality. Every night, it came without fail, always at the same time, 3:33 a.m. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the neighbors. Thin walls, an old building, it made sense. But as the nights passed, I noticed something unsettling. The sound was always the same rhythm, the same pitch, the same heart-wrenching despair. It didn't waver, didn't change. By the fifth night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as I strained to pinpoint the source. The sobbing didn't seem to come from any specific direction. It filled the air, surrounding me like a cloud of sorrow. I started leaving lights on, hoping their warmth would chase away the cold that seemed to seep into my bones at night. But it didn't help. The apartment felt alive, as if the walls themselves were mourning alongside the sobbing voice. The worst part wasn't the sound itself, it was the emotions it stirred in me. Each night, I felt an overwhelming wave of sadness that didn't belong to me. A weight settled on my chest, making it hard to breathe, as if the sorrow was seeping into my very soul. I tried talking myself down. It's stress, I whispered to the empty room. Your mind is playing tricks on you. But the words rang hollow. Deep down, I knew this wasn't just my imagination. One night, I decided to record it. If I could capture the sound, maybe I could prove to myself that it was real, or that it wasn't. I set my phone to record, placing it on the nightstand before lying down, wide-eyed and waiting. At exactly 3:33, the sobbing began. This time, I didn't turn away. I forced myself to listen, every hair on my body standing on end. The sound was clearer now, less muffled. A woman's voice, broken and desperate, crying for something or someone. When morning finally came, I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and played the recording. My stomach dropped as I listened. Nothing. The recording was silent. No sobbing. No sound at all, except for my own uneven breathing. I stared at the screen, my heart sinking. It wasn't just in my head. This thing, whatever it was, didn't want to be heard. The next night, I couldn't stay in bed any longer. When the sobbing started at exactly 3:33 a.m., I forced myself to get up. My pulse raced as I grabbed my phone, its flashlight cutting through the dark as I stepped into the hallway. The sound was louder here, still coming from no specific direction but filling the space like a heavy fog. I turned slowly, trying to pinpoint its origin, but it seemed to shift, as though it were moving with me. "Where are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the soft, broken cries. I searched every room. The kitchen was empty, the counters cold and lifeless. The bathroom mirror reflected only my own pale face, my wide eyes filled with fear. In the living room, the air felt heavier, almost suffocating, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Then I reached the hallway, where the locked door stood waiting. The sobbing grew clearer here, more distinct. My skin prickled as I approached the door, the flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the gleaming brass knob. The air was icy now, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I reached out hesitantly, my hand hovering over the handle. The chill was unbearable, biting into my skin like needles. But what made me pull back wasn't the cold, it was the faint sound that came from the other side. A sharp, hitching breath. Someone, or something, was behind the door. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The sobbing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it rang in my ears. For a moment, I thought I heard faint whispers, but they were too low to make out, like words spoken underwater. My heart thundered in my chest as I backed away, retreating to the living room. The chill seemed to follow me, clinging to my skin like frost. I wrapped myself in a blanket, but it didn't help. The cold wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something wrong. As the minutes dragged on, the apartment remained silent. The sobbing didn't return that night, but the air felt charged, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I stayed on the couch until dawn, clutching my phone like a lifeline and staring at the locked door, now more ominous than ever. Whatever was happening in this apartment, it wasn't just in my head. Something was here with me, and it was getting closer. I couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in my chest, like a dark weight that wouldn't lift. Each night, I felt the presence of something watching me, waiting. The apartment, once just an inconvenient step in my life after the breakup, had become something far worse. It was suffocating. And the sobbing, always at 3:33 a.m., had now become a nightly ritual. The next afternoon, I ran into Mrs. Gibbons, the elderly woman who lived in the apartment next door. She was standing in the hallway, her arms full of groceries, struggling with the door. I quickly offered to help, hoping the distraction would take my mind off the mounting dread. "Thank you, dear," she said with a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. There was something about the way she looked at me, shrewd, knowing, that made me hesitate. As I helped her inside, the weight in my chest seemed to grow heavier. We exchanged small talk, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't help but wonder if she knew anything about the apartment, about the sobbing. Mrs. Gibbons, I started, unsure of how to approach the subject. This building. It's old, right? Has anything strange ever happened here? She paused, her hand frozen on the doorframe. For a moment, I thought she hadn't heard me, but then she sighed and turned toward me. Her eyes were narrowed, the lines of her face deepening in a way that made me feel like I was intruding on something I shouldn't know. You mean, the girl? She asked, her voice soft and deliberate. I froze. The girl? She nodded slowly, her gaze distant, as if remembering something that had been buried for years. It was about 15 years ago. A young girl, maybe in her 20s, moved into the apartment you're in now. Her name was Emily. Emily. The name felt foreign on my tongue. I didn't know why, but I was suddenly desperate to know more. What happened to her? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Gibbons hesitated, her hands gripping her grocery bags so tightly her knuckles went white. She disappeared. No one knew what happened. One day, she was just gone. Left all her things behind, clothes, books, everything. There was a lot of talk in the building, but no one ever saw her again. I tried to keep my composure, but my pulse was racing. What kind of talk? She looked at me again, her eyes narrowing. People said she wasn't, well, not all there, you know? Quiet. Always to herself. And sometimes, at night, people heard her crying. They thought it was just a phase, but her voice trailed off, and she looked over her shoulder as if checking for someone, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Some people say it wasn't her crying. I swallowed hard, the air in the hallway suddenly feeling too thick to breathe. What do you mean? But before Mrs. Gibbons could answer, she shook her head, as if dismissing her own words. Best not to think too much about it, dear. People get strange ideas when they've been here too long. She patted my arm gently, a forced smile returning to her lips. You're young. You'll be fine. But I wasn't fine. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as she turned away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Something about the way she said it, the way her words were laced with fear, haunted me. The sobbing. Emily. It was all starting to fit together in a way that made my skin crawl. That night, I didn't wait for 3:33 a.m. I was already awake, sitting on the couch, staring at the locked door in the hallway. I couldn't help but wonder if Emily had left. Something behind. Something that hadn't been found. Something that might still be waiting to be uncovered. And I was the one who had to find it. The nights grew worse, each one a nightmare waiting to unfold. I tried to sleep, to escape into the comfort of oblivion, but sleep was no longer a refuge. It had become a gateway to something darker. It started small, flashes of images that didn't quite make sense, flickers of faces in the dark, whispers that drifted in and out of my dreams. But soon, it became vivid. In the dreams, I was in the apartment, standing in the hallway just outside the locked door. The sobbing was louder now, deafening, filling every corner of the space. I tried to approach it, but something pulled me back, as if the air itself was thick with an invisible force that held me in place. And then I saw her. She was standing at the door, Emily. Her face was pale, eyes hollow, as if the life had been drained from her. Her hair was tangled, falling around her face in damp, matted strands. She reached out to me, her mouth opening in a silent scream, but no sound came. Her fingers were frozen in midair, as if she were begging for help, but the words never reached me. I wanted to move, to rush toward her, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, my feet rooted to the floor as though I was trapped in a dream. And then, as if on cue, the door creaked open by itself, a slow, agonizing sound that echoed in the silence. A cold wind rushed out, so sharp that it cut through me like ice. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, a tortured wail that clawed at my very soul. I felt the chill reach into my bones, seeping into every inch of my skin. Behind the door was darkness. The kind of darkness that felt alive, like it was waiting for something. I reached out, against my will, drawn to it. As my hand touched the doorframe, the world around me began to twist. The apartment blurred, and the air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around me. And then, I saw her again, Emily, standing right behind me. Her eyes were no longer empty. They were full of something. Something malicious. Her lips parted, and for the first time, I heard her voice. "Help me." The words were jagged, broken. But they weren't a plea for help, they were a command. I turned to face her, but she wasn't the same anymore. Her face was twisted in agony, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she were begging me to look away. Her hands shot out, fingers like claws, and I tried to scream, to pull away, but my body wouldn't respond. She was pulling me toward the door. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart thudded in my chest, my mind racing to make sense of the nightmare that felt too real. I stared at the ceiling, the echoes of Emily's voice still ringing in my ears. The apartment felt different now. The walls seemed to breathe with me, and the air had a heaviness that made every movement feel sluggish. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 3:33 a.m. The sobbing started again. I sat up, my legs shaking beneath me. The dream had felt so real, like it had pulled something out of me, like it had left a mark on my soul. I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was still here, watching, waiting for me to do something. I needed to know what was behind that door. I needed to find the truth. The nightmares continued, each one more disturbing than the last, and the apartment felt colder, emptier, as though it were slowly swallowing me whole. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. The line between dream and reality blurred more each night, and the sobbing was always there, always at 3:33 a.m., a constant presence in the background of my life. But it wasn't just the dreams. It was the little things, the things I couldn't explain. I first noticed it when I went to grab my coffee cup in the kitchen. It wasn't where I'd left it. I was sure I'd placed it on the counter the night before, next to the sink. But when I went to reach for it, the spot was empty. A small, insignificant thing, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I checked the living room next, looking around in confusion. My keys were missing. I had left them on the coffee table, next to my phone, but now they were gone. I retraced my steps, searching every corner of the apartment, but there was no sign of them. I tried to tell myself I was just forgetful, that maybe I had moved them in my sleep. But deep down, I knew something else was at play. It wasn't just the missing objects, it was the way the air had changed, how the space itself felt wrong. The floorboards creaked in strange rhythms, as though someone, or something, was walking in the other room when no one was there. I'd find things out of place, move just enough that I couldn't be sure of anything anymore. A chair pushed back from the table. A book I didn't remember opening, now resting on the arm of the couch. The rug, which had been perfectly aligned with the floor, now crooked and askew. One evening, I stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My hands were shaking, my breath shallow and rapid. It was then that I noticed the small, faint marks on my neck. I reached up to touch them, only to find my fingers brushing against something wet. A drop of blood. I looked closer, but the blood wasn't fresh. It was old, dried, as if it had been there for days. I stared at myself, my mind racing, and then, in the reflection, I saw it. A shadow, moving behind me in the corner of the bathroom. I spun around, but no one was there. I wiped the blood from my neck, feeling the cold sweat bead on my forehead. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. Something was in here with me. Watching. Waiting. The next day, I decided to confront the locked door. I had to know what was behind it. But when I reached for the handle, something stopped me. The door was open. I froze, staring at the gap in the doorway, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the room behind the door was holding its breath, waiting for me to step inside. For a moment, I hesitated. The logical part of me screamed to run, to get out of the apartment, to leave this place behind. But the other part, the part that was drawn to the mystery, the part that had to know, pushed me forward. I stepped inside. The room was pitch black, the air colder than I had ever felt it before. The darkness seemed to reach out, clinging to me, pulling me deeper into the room. I fumbled for the light switch, but before I could find it, a voice whispered in the darkness. It was Emily's voice. "Help me." I stumbled back, my heart racing, but there was no time to react. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The sobbing started again, louder this time, so close it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. And then, I heard the sound of footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Methodical. They were coming for me. The door had always been a barrier, a wall between me and whatever lay hidden in the apartment. For days, I had fought the impulse to open it, terrified of what I might find, but the nightmares had grown too vivid, too real. The sobbing, Emily's pleading voice, it all led me here. The door was calling to me now, more than ever before. The moment I touched the handle, my skin prickled with cold, a deep, unnatural chill that made my fingers go numb. It felt as if the air itself was resisting, but I twisted the knob anyway. The lock clicked open with an eerie finality, and I hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door ajar. I wasn't ready for what I found on the other side. The room beyond the door was completely still, the kind of stillness that felt wrong, like time itself had stopped moving in that space. Dust hung in the air like smoke, thick and heavy, as if the room hadn't been touched in years. The faint smell of decay lingered, clinging to the walls and floor, mixing with the musty scent of old furniture. The light from the hallway spilled into the darkness, but it barely made a dent in the shadows. The room felt suffocating, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to step inside. I could feel the weight of its silence pressing down on me, but I couldn't turn back now. I crossed the threshold, each step taking me deeper into the cold, oppressive space. My footsteps echoed in the silence, sounding too loud in the emptiness. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, the kind that hadn't been disturbed in years. Cobwebs stretched across the corners of the room, and the air felt stale, like it had been locked away for a long time. There was a single window, its glass cracked and covered with grime. I tried to peer outside, but all I could see was the dark outline of the building across the street. Nothing seemed to move in the room. Nothing stirred. But there was something off about it. I walked further into the room, my breath shallow, eyes darting around for anything that might explain the strange feeling settling in my chest. The walls were lined with old furniture, covered in sheets that looked as though they had been left in haste. A bed, an old chair, and a small wooden desk sat against the walls, each covered in dust and shadows. It was as though someone had lived here not long ago, but had vanished without a trace. I reached the desk first, my hands trembling as I ran them over the surface. Papers were scattered across the top, old, yellowed, with faded ink. I bent down, carefully picking them up, and tried to make sense of the writing. But the words were indecipherable, blurred with age and neglect. A faint scraping sound caught my attention, and I looked up. There, near the far corner, was a large, ornate mirror. The frame was gilded, but worn with time, its surface cloudy with dust. I could barely make out my reflection in the glass, distorted and blurred, but as I stepped closer, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The reflection was wrong. In the mirror, there was someone else standing behind me. A figure, just barely visible, like a shadow in the dim light. I spun around quickly, but there was no one there. My pulse thundered in my ears as I took a step back, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? My hands were shaking now, and I could feel the sweat gathering on my forehead. This place, it was alive with something, some presence that was watching me. I turned back to the mirror, my reflection staring back at me, but the figure was still there. Only now, it wasn't just a shadow. It was Emily. Her face, pale and twisted with fear, stared back at me from the mirror. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her lips parted in a silent scream. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. I reached out to touch the glass, my fingers brushing against its cold surface, and for a brief moment, I thought I felt something stir inside the reflection. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The room felt even colder now, the temperature dropping as if the very air had frozen. My body was shaking, and the sobbing I had grown so accustomed to, began again. It was louder now, coming from every direction, filling the room like a tangible force. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I turned to head for the door, I noticed something else. On the far side of the room, in the corner by the bed, was something I hadn't seen before. A small, wooden box, half hidden beneath the sheet. I felt a pull toward it, an irresistible urge to open it. Without thinking, I crossed the room, my heart pounding, and knelt down beside the bed. The box was old, its surface scratched and worn. I lifted the lid, my breath caught in my throat. Inside, there was nothing but a single, faded photograph of Emily. And behind her, the faint outline of the locked door. The photograph in the box seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though it held some sort of power over me. Emily's face stared back at me, her expression distant, like she was staring at something far beyond the camera's reach. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Her face was so familiar now, a haunting presence that I couldn't escape. But it was the background of the photo that held my attention, the same locked door, barely visible behind her, its surface worn and scratched. I pulled my gaze away from the image, my hands trembling as I placed it back in the box. I didn't want to look at it anymore. It felt like it was pushing me towards something I wasn't ready to face. But it was too late. Something in the box had caught my eye. There was a small, leather-bound diary beneath the photo, its cover torn and faded with age. The corners were frayed, as though it had been opened and closed repeatedly over the years. I didn't know why, but I felt an overwhelming need to read it. I hesitated only for a moment before I opened the first page. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, as though the writer was rushing to get their thoughts down before they were lost forever. The entries were dated, but the ink was faded, making some of the words hard to read. The first entry was dated months ago, and it sent a chill down my spine. April 17th. I feel like I'm losing my mind. The apartment is alive, and it's watching me. I hear the sobbing at night, always at the same time. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't sleep. I can't escape. It's everywhere, and it's getting worse. I have to get out, but I can't. I'm trapped. I flip to the next page. April 22nd. It's here. The girl. I saw her in the mirror today. She was standing behind me, just like I've seen in my dreams. I tried to speak, to ask her what she wants, but she just stared at me, her eyes hollow. She's trying to tell me something. I can feel it. The sobbing is getting louder, and it's coming from inside the walls now. The locked door. I don't know what's behind it, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid to open it. But I have to. I have to know. My breath caught in my throat as I read. Every word felt like it was written for me, as though Emily's desperation was echoing through time and space. I turned the page, my heart racing. April 30th. It's not just the girl. Something else is here, too. I don't know what it is, but it's pulling at me, dragging me deeper into this place. I tried to leave today, but the door wouldn't open. It's like the apartment is refusing to let me go. I'm not sure if I'm still in the real world anymore. The walls are closing in, and I can feel them watching me. The girl, she's still here, and she's getting closer. I hear her footsteps while I'm alone. They're getting closer, always closer. I felt my skin crawl as I read those words. They mirrored the thoughts I've been having since I moved in, this suffocating sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I turned another page. The entries were becoming more frantic, the writing more erratic. May 7th. She won't leave me alone. I can hear her crying all the time now. It's coming from inside the walls, from the other side of the door. I saw her again today. She was standing in the hallway, her hand reaching out to me. I don't know what she wants, but I'm scared. I think she's trying to warn me. The door. It's the key. But it's locked, and I can't open it. The sobbing, it won't stop. I'm losing my mind. I can feel her breath on my neck. She's behind me, always behind me. The entries became a blur after that, fragments of fear, desperation, and a growing sense of doom. The last few pages were nearly illegible, as if the writer had lost the ability to form coherent thoughts. But one entry stood out above all the others. It was the last one in the diary, dated just days before Emily vanished. May 12th. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do anymore. It's too late. She's inside me now. The door. It's open. It's already too late. The sobbing will never stop. I can feel her in my skin. I can feel her inside me. It's not just the apartment. It's me. She's me now. I slammed the diary shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in around me. The sobbing had stopped, but there was something else now, a presence in the room that I couldn't shake. The silence was deafening. I had to leave. But as I turned to go, something caught my eye, a shadow in the corner of the room, barely visible, standing just beyond the edge of the bed. It was Emily. Her hollow eyes stared back at me from the darkness. And I knew, in that moment, that it was too late for me too. I couldn't shake the image of Emily's face from my mind as I sat there, clutching the diary. My heart was still racing, my hands trembling, but I couldn't stop myself from flipping back through the pages. The cryptic entries, the desperate, disjointed words, were like a map leading me through the madness Emily had experienced. Each page felt like a deeper descent into the unknown, into the dark place where the line between the living and the dead blurred. I had to understand. I had to know what had driven her to the edge of her sanity. I forced myself to read on, though my stomach churned as the dread inched higher. One of the later entries described something that sent a shiver through my spine. Emily had written about a presence, something beyond the walls of the apartment, something far older than the building itself. May 8th. I saw it again. It was there, just behind the mirror. It's not a person, not a thing you can see or touch. It's a shadow, a darkness that feeds on fear. It watches me, waits for me to slip. It's not just the girl, it's something else. Something worse. I don't know how long it's been here, but I know it's been here longer than I have. Longer than anyone. I've tried to run, but it's everywhere. It comes through the walls, through the cracks in the floor. I hear it breathing, slow and steady, like it's waiting for something. Maybe for me to give up. Maybe for me to open the door. I don't know. I just know that it's coming. And the girl, she's part of it. She's not a victim. She's a warning. I read the words again, trying to make sense of them, but it felt like my brain was spinning in circles. A shadow that fed on fear? Something ancient and malevolent, lurking in the corners of the apartment? It sounded insane, but the longer I stayed in this place, the more the strange events seemed to make sense. I flipped back to the previous page, hoping to find more answers. And then I found it, something that chilled me to my core. Emily had written about the presence in greater detail, and what I read made my blood run cold. May 9th. It speaks to me now. It's not in words, not in a language I can understand, but I hear it. It whispers, low and soft, like the wind through the trees. It's telling me things I don't want to know. It's telling me that I am its next victim. That I am its prey. And the girl is the key. I've seen her in my dreams, but now she's in my waking hours too. She's not real. She can't be. She's just a projection of whatever is in the walls, a manifestation of the thing that's hunting me. But why me? Why here? I think it's been waiting for someone like me. Someone who would listen to the whispers, someone who would open the door. I've made a terrible mistake. I've seen it. I've opened the door, and now it knows me. It knows who I am. It's inside me. It won't stop until it has everything. I close my eyes, trying to block out the panic rising in my chest. The girl, Emily, wasn't the only one tormented in this apartment. Something darker, something far more terrifying, had been feeding on fear for years. And Emily had become part of it, a conduit, a way for the thing in the walls to manifest itself. I felt sick to my stomach, the weight of her words crushing me. But there was still more. I couldn't stop reading, couldn't stop myself from turning the pages despite the dread building inside me. May 10th. It's not over. It's never over. The door, it's still here. I tried to leave again, but the hallway was different. It's like the apartment is changing, shifting. The layout doesn't make sense anymore. The door is still there, and it's calling me. But I can't open it. I can't let it in. I'm afraid, more than I've ever been. The thing is here, in the room with me. It's crawling, scratching, whispering my name. I can feel its breath on the back of my neck. I can feel it everywhere. I hear it every time I close my eyes. The girl. She's in the mirror. She's part of it. She's warning me, trying to tell me that the thing inside the walls is coming for me. It's coming for me. The final entry was almost illegible, the handwriting smeared as if Emily had been frantic, her mind unraveling in the final moments of her life. But one thing was clear, whatever had been tormenting her, whatever had been watching and whispering, was still here. I was in its grasp now. The room felt colder, and the sobbing started again, louder, more insistent. It was everywhere, echoing through the walls, through the very air. It was as if the apartment itself had come alive, responding to the terror that gripped me. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I had the overwhelming sense that I was no longer alone in the room. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard something else, something even more terrifying than the sobbing. It was a voice, but it wasn't Emily's. It was something older, darker, and it whispered one word in my ear. Help. The sobbing had never been so loud before. It filled the apartment, reverberating off the walls, creeping into every corner of my mind. I tried to block it out, tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, but it was impossible. The sound of crying, high-pitched, tortured, echoed through the space, dragging me into a dark pit of unease. It was always the same time, always at night. But tonight was different. The sobbing had become frantic, desperate, as if the girl, Emily, was calling out for help. The air around me seemed to grow thicker with every passing second, as if something was pressing down, suffocating me with its weight. I stood at the threshold of the locked door, staring at its worn surface. My fingers twitched as they reached toward the handle, my mind telling me to turn away, but my body refused to listen. There was something in me now, some deep, instinctual pull toward that door. I had to know. I had to understand what was behind it. But as my hand grazed the cold metal of the doorknob, a sharp pain shot through my chest, like a searing burn from the inside. It was as if the door itself was rejecting me, as if the very thing that lay behind it had sensed my presence. I staggered back, clutching my chest, gasping for air. The sobbing grew louder, more guttural, as if the girl herself were in agony. I looked around, my heart racing, searching for the source, but there was nothing except the oppressive silence that followed the wails. My head was spinning, and the pain in my chest hadn't subsided. The room was colder now, colder than it had ever been, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the pile of belongings I had left scattered around the room, but my body was too weak to keep me steady. I couldn't think. My mind was racing, replaying Emily's words from the diary over and over. The thing in the walls. The girl isn't real. It's inside me now. I felt like I was losing control of my own body, like something was crawling under my skin, pulling me toward the door. The sobbing intensified, and with it, the pain. It wasn't just in my chest anymore, it was everywhere. It was in my limbs, in my bones. It was like I had been stabbed, but the wound was inside me, deep and relentless. I tried to move away, but my legs wouldn't obey. I could only watch helpless, as the room seemed to stretch and distort, the edges of the walls warping like the room was shifting, changing its shape. The temperature had plummeted, and I felt the coldness seep into my very soul. The sobbing was no longer a distant sound. It was in my ears, right next to me, as if someone were standing behind me, their breath cold on my neck. My skin crawled with the sensation, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. I was alone. But I wasn't. The pain intensified, a sharp, pulsing ache that shot through my spine and left me gasping for breath. I dropped to my knees, the weight of it nearly too much to bear. My hands gripped the floor, my fingers digging into the carpet as if trying to anchor myself to reality. It was the door. I could feel its presence, even though I wasn't touching it. It was like it was pulling on me, slowly, steadily, drawing me closer. And I could feel the thing behind it, whatever it was, waiting, watching, and feeding on my fear. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The sobbing grew louder, mingling with my own frantic heartbeat. The pain was unbearable now, like an electric current was surging through my veins. It felt as though something was clawing its way inside of me, tearing at my insides. And then, in a moment of clarity, I realized the truth. The door wasn't just a barrier. It was a portal, a conduit to whatever force haunted this apartment. And the more I lingered, the more I suffered. With every passing second, the walls pressed in closer, the air growing more suffocating. The sobbing was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, something that wrapped around me, suffocating me with its desperation. I had to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The door was calling me, drawing me in, and with it came the promise of something terrible. Something that would change me forever if I allowed myself to get too close. As I pushed myself up from the floor, I heard it, a low whisper, too faint to fully understand, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. It wasn't the girl's voice. It was something darker, older, more menacing. And then I felt it, something cold, sharp, like fingers closing around my throat. I couldn't breathe. And the door was still there, waiting. The suffocating darkness of the room pressed in around me, the air thick with the bitter cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I tried to steady my breathing, my hands trembling as I fought to stay conscious. The pain had finally started to subside, though it still lingered like a dull ache deep within me. I couldn't focus. My thoughts were fragmented, shattered, like pieces of glass scattered across the floor. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It was quick, flickering at the edge of my vision, darting across the room so fast that I almost doubted I had seen it at all. But the lingering chill in the air, the thick sense of something wrong in the room, told me otherwise. I whipped my head around, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out the sobbing for a brief moment. I scanned the space, my breath catching in my throat as my eyes darted from corner to corner. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive silence and the smell of mildew, old wood, and decay. It was just my imagination, I tried to tell myself. I'm losing it. But then, just as I began to convince myself that it was nothing, I saw it again. A figure, dark and vague, shifting like smoke in the corner of the room. It wasn't human. It was too wrong to be human. The shape was indistinct, almost formless, its edges blurring as if the thing existed somewhere between the physical world and the void. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. This was no longer just a noise, no longer just the sensation of something wrong. It was real. The apartment was haunted by something that wasn't just a ghost. I tried to step back, my legs unsteady beneath me. But the moment I moved, the figure seemed to react, darting toward me, its presence becoming more defined, more tangible, as it materialized in the dim light. It was tall, though its exact shape remained indistinct. Its limbs were long, unnaturally so, and its body seemed to stretch in ways that made my stomach churn. The shadow was too dark to distinguish any details, but its energy was suffocating, malevolent. It was a distortion in the air, a thing that shouldn't exist. And it was staring at me. Not with eyes, at least, not in the way that humans did. But there was something in its gaze, something that pierced me to my core, making every instinct in my body scream at me to run. But I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, my body locked in place as if the figure had a hold on me. It felt like the room was getting smaller, like the walls were slowly closing in, and the shadow was the force that was squeezing the air out of my lungs. The sobbing continued, but now it had become something else, something more desperate, more pained. I opened my mouth to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, and my vision blurred, darkening at the edges as if I was being pulled into a different reality, a deeper layer of the nightmare. The figure took a step toward me, and I froze. It wasn't just standing anymore, it was moving, fluidly, like it was both there and not there. Like it could slip through the fabric of reality at will. The sound of its movements was barely audible, but it was there, a soft, unnatural rustling, like the sound of dead leaves being blown across the floor, faint and distant. And then it spoke. Not with words. Not with a voice. But in my mind. Leave. The command was sharp, but it wasn't a command of force. It was the whisper of inevitability, the cold certainty that I had no choice but to obey. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest, my body too weak to escape, yet my mind screamed for me to move. But just as quickly as it appeared, the figure began to fade. The darkness seemed to evaporate as it receded into the corner, becoming little more than a patch of shifting shadows that swallowed itself. For a moment, the room was silent again. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as if I'd been holding my breath for far too long. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, soaking my clothes. The pain in my chest was gone now, replaced by an overwhelming sense of terror. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still there, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to make my next move. I forced myself to rise, my legs unsteady, my whole body shaking as if I had just witnessed something I was never meant to see. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this apartment anymore. I turned to face the door, and for the first time since I had moved in, I felt the weight of it, the heaviness of the thing behind it. The sobbing was still there. But now, it wasn't just a sound. It was a warning. Leave, or be consumed. I couldn't stay in that apartment. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the shadows lingered in every corner, waiting. That figure, the one I'd seen move like a wraith, had haunted my thoughts since the moment it vanished. My pulse still raced when I thought about it, and the chilling sensation of its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, pressing into me had not faded. But despite everything, I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand the girl, the entity that had tormented me, and the truth behind this damned apartment. I had to confront it. The first thing I did the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, was pull out my laptop and start researching. I had no idea where to start, but I had to try. There had to be something out there about the girl, about the apartment's history. I googled the address, typed the words into the search bar, Chicago haunted apartments, mysterious disappearances, Emily T., but most of the results were generic, clickbait headlines about local ghost stories, nothing of substance. It wasn't until I stumbled upon an old online forum that something caught my eye. The title of the thread read, "The Vanishing Girl, an Old Tragedy in Chicago's West Side." I clicked it, my heart pounding, a sense of urgency swelling in my chest. I read through the posts, some more than a decade old, but they spoke of a girl named Emily, someone who had lived in my building many years ago. From the entries, I pieced together bits and pieces of her story. Emily was a young woman, an artist who had moved into the building in the early 90s, according to the forum's oldest posts. She had been quiet, reclusive, but friendly enough with neighbors. There were a few mentions of her beauty, her soft-spoken nature, but also whispers of something darker, something off about her. The most disturbing part came from one user who described the apartment she had rented. The very same apartment I was now living in. Apparently, before Emily moved in, the unit had been vacant for several months. When she first arrived, no one thought much of it. But gradually, people noticed that something was wrong. The woman never seemed to leave her apartment. Her neighbors recalled hearing strange noises late at night, scratching sounds, muffled cries, and the occasional sound of broken glass. And one neighbor, an older man, spoke of a faint light in the apartment at odd hours, like the flicker of a candle. I shuddered as I read those words. It sounded too familiar. But what happened next was even worse. Emily's sudden disappearance. A post from a local news article appeared, detailing the tragic event. Emily had gone missing one night. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. Her landlord reported her absence after several days, and the police launched a search, but they found nothing. The apartment was locked, undisturbed, with no clues about where she had gone. But something even more chilling was mentioned in the article, Emily's diary, which had been discovered after the search. The diary spoke of an oppressive, malicious presence in the apartment. Emily wrote of a dark figure, something she had tried to avoid for months, something that tormented her in the night. She described being followed, stalked by an unseen force that whispered in the dark, urged her to stay locked away, never leave. And the final entry, written just days before she disappeared, was the most unsettling of all. It read, "I can feel it coming. It knows I'm afraid. I won't let it win. But I don't know how much longer I can fight." I sat back, staring at the screen, my hands shaking as I closed the laptop. This wasn't just some tragic accident. Emily hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken by whatever had haunted this apartment before me. The entity. The one I had seen in that room. I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. I wasn't just dealing with a ghost or a residual haunting. No, this was something far more dangerous, far more alive than anything I had imagined. Emily's terror, her pain, it had seeped into the very fabric of this place, this building. Whatever had taken her was still here. And now, it was coming for me. My mind raced as I tried to put the pieces together. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay in this apartment any longer. It was only a matter of time before whatever force had claimed Emily came for me as well. But where could I go? The figure, the girl, the shadow, it wasn't just a haunting. It was a curse. Something had tethered that entity to this place, to this apartment, and as long as I was here, I was just as trapped as Emily had been. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I had to escape, but I had no idea how. I could hardly breathe as I closed the laptop. The weight of the truth pressed down on me, but it wasn't just the fear of the entity that kept me frozen. It was the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to every inch of the apartment, as if the walls themselves were aware of what I had learned. I knew I couldn't stay here, not with what I now understood. But I also knew that I couldn't leave without answers. The pain of the entity's grasp of Emily's spirit had already begun to gnaw at me. Before I could spiral any further into my thoughts, a sudden knock at the door snapped me from my stupor. My heart jumped and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Who could it be at this hour? Hesitant, I stood up, my legs still shaky, and walked slowly toward the door. When I opened it, I was met by Mrs. Greer, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. Her tired eyes looked even wearier than usual, her thin face drawn with an expression of deep concern. She had always been friendly, but I'd never seen her look so distressed. "Alex," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you. It's about the apartment." I stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She didn't wait for an invitation but made her way into the living room, looking around nervously as if making sure no one could overhear her. I followed her, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "Sit down," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please. I don't have much time." I sat across from her, my mind racing. Was she going to confirm what I had learned? "I don't know how much longer I can stay here," she began, her wrinkled hands clasped tightly in her lap. "But I can't just sit by and watch you go through what the others did." My heart skipped a beat. "The others?" I repeated, leaning forward. She nodded slowly. "You're not the first. This apartment, this building, it's cursed. Or haunted. I don't know what to call it anymore." She paused, glancing at the windows, as if making sure no one could hear. "But every person who's lived here in that apartment, well, they've all suffered." Her words hit me like a slap. My blood ran cold. I had felt it, the strange, suffocating atmosphere, the shadows closing in. But I had no idea the suffering was this widespread. "Do you mean Emily?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded again. "I wasn't here when she moved in, but I knew her. We all did. She was sweet, a bit quiet, but kind. But I saw the changes in her, saw how she started to lock herself away, never leaving. She stopped talking to people, and I think she started hearing things." Mrs. Greer's voice cracked, and she cleared her throat. "But it wasn't just her. You see, after she disappeared, other people came and went. And every time someone new moved in, the same thing happened. It wasn't long before they started noticing things. At first, it's small, a cold spot here or there, a sound in the night. But then it escalates. It always escalates." I could feel my pulse quickening. "Escalates?" "Yes." She lowered her voice to a near whisper. "People start seeing things. Things that shouldn't be there. Shadows in the corners of their vision. Figures moving just out of reach. And the noises, the cries. Some of them get worse. I don't know how to explain it. It's like the apartment is feeding on them." I swallowed, trying to understand. My thoughts raced as I recalled the things I'd experienced, the chill in the room, the strange sounds, the shadowy figure I had seen. I had brushed them off, thinking they were part of the haunting. But now, I realized they were part of something more sinister, something that preyed on the people who stayed too long. "But why haven't you left?" I asked, a part of me incredulous. Her eyes darkened, and her voice lowered even more. I can't. None of us can. She let out a soft sigh, as if the weight of her own confession was too much to bear. The people who stayed, who tried to leave, well, they didn't get far. She stared at me, her eyes full of fear. Once you've been marked by it, once it knows you, it doesn't let you go. People have tried to leave this place, but something always happens. They get hurt. Or worse, they vanish, just like Emily did. My stomach twisted into a knot, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I looked at her, trying to make sense of it all. But how do you know this? How can you be sure? Mrs. Greer's voice became a hollow whisper. I was here when the last man left. The one before you. He came to me, asking for help. But he couldn't leave either. He tried to get away, and something chased him. He said the apartment itself was alive, like it was trapping him inside. He begged me to help him, but by the time the police arrived, she trailed off, unable to finish. My mind reeled as I processed her words. The apartment didn't just haunt people, it trapped them, kept them prisoner. And that explained the terrifying sensation I'd felt, the gnawing feeling that no matter how hard I tried to leave, I was tethered here. It's coming for you, too, she continued, her voice breaking. And it won't stop until you're either consumed or you disappear just like the others. I stood up, unable to stay seated any longer. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder, as if the very building was listening, waiting for me to make my next move. I could feel it. The presence was there, somewhere in the shadows, just beyond reach. How do I get out? I whispered, desperate. Mrs. Greer looked up at me, her expression one of sadness and regret. Leave now, she said, her voice filled with finality. Before it's too late. I barely slept that night. The words Mrs. Greer had shared echoed in my mind, the warnings weighing heavily on my thoughts. Leave now. How could I leave? If I ran, would it follow me? Or worse, would it trap me somewhere else? I couldn't escape. I had learned too much, and now I was a part of its story, whether I liked it or not. The next morning, I took every precaution. I kept the lights on, locked every door, and tried to prepare myself. But something felt off. The silence was thick, too thick, like the air had turned to tar. Every corner of the apartment felt alive, watching, waiting. By evening, the weight of it all became unbearable. The sobbing started again, soft at first, a faint, pitiful cry that seeped through the walls. But this time, I wasn't just hearing it from afar. It felt closer, too close, like it was coming from within the very room. I stood still, my breath shallow, unable to move. The cry became louder, more desperate, growing in intensity with every passing second. And then, it changed. The sobbing twisted, warped into something darker. The soft whimpering became guttural, a shrill scream that echoed through the apartment. The sound was deafening, splitting my mind in two. It was as if the very walls themselves were screaming. I stumbled back, my knees weak beneath me as I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise. But it wasn't working. The sound pierced my skull like a knife. I couldn't take it any longer. I ran to the hallway, trying to get away, but the screams followed, echoing, swelling. The sobs turned into shrieks, then into wails of agony. Each scream was worse than the last, filled with terror, with pain, with the purest form of despair. Suddenly, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, an unnatural chill that sunk deep into my bones. My breath became visible in the freezing air. I heard the unmistakable sound of furniture scraping against the floor, a loud, grinding noise that sent a jolt of terror through my veins. I turned just in time to see the sofa in the living room move violently, as though an invisible hand was shoving it across the floor. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my thoughts spinning. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't something I could explain away anymore. It was real. The force in this apartment, whatever it was real. And it wasn't happy that I had learned its secret. The sofa slammed against the wall, shaking the floor beneath me. I couldn't move, my body frozen in fear. The bookshelf behind it creaked as it was shoved forward, books flying off the shelves, landing in a chaotic mess around me. The air vibrated with the force of it all, and the temperature continued to drop, plunging into a bone-chilling cold. But it didn't stop there. The table in the corner of the room tipped over, crashing to the ground, the sharp sound of wood splitting echoing in my ears. The lamp shattered, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor like a storm of tiny, deadly stars. I screamed out, instinctively crawling to the door, but it was as if the apartment itself was closing in on me. The door wouldn't budge. It was as if the entire space had become a living nightmare, suffocating me from all sides. Then, just as quickly as the violence had begun, everything went silent. I stood there, breathless, shaking, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The temperature seemed to return to normal, but the damage was everywhere, furniture overturned, glass on the floor, everything in disarray. But the worst part was the stillness. The eerie calm that followed the storm. It was as if the apartment was letting me know it was in control. It had always been in control. The sobbing returned, but now it was no longer just a sound, it was a presence. A voice, deep and distorted, whispered directly into my ear. "Help me." The words were so close, so personal, that I could almost feel the breath of the spirit on my skin. It wasn't a cry for sympathy. It wasn't the pleading of a lost soul, it was a demand. A command. The pressure in the air grew heavier. I could feel it pushing against me, squeezing the air from my lungs, making it harder to breathe. The entity wanted something from me. It was using Emily's torment as a lure, feeding off my fear, drawing me deeper into its web. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that it wasn't going to let me go. I backed away, stumbling toward the window, desperate for any way out. The spirit wasn't content to let me be, it needed me to feel it. It needed me to stay, to face what had happened to Emily, and to understand the price of uncovering its truth. But I wasn't sure how much longer I could endure this. And as I stood there, paralyzed by terror, I realized that I was no longer just a witness to the haunting. I was part of it now. The entity had marked me, just as it had marked Emily. And it was only a matter of time before I became its next victim. The room was too quiet now, and I couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wouldn't be able to stop. My pulse throbbed in my ears, my hands shaking as I reached for the edge of the window, as if hoping the cool night air could ground me. But it didn't work. No matter how I tried to rationalize what was happening, it was no use. My rational mind was already lost in the grip of something much older, darker, and more powerful than I could comprehend. Suddenly, I felt it again. The cold, creeping sensation slithered up my spine. It started as a light chill, like the breeze of a passing wind, but it quickly deepened into something far more sinister, an icy grip that wrapped around my chest and made it hard to breathe. Then, I saw her. She appeared in front of me, her figure materializing from the shadows as if the darkness itself had given birth to her. Emily. Her form was translucent, faint, but unmistakably real. She was pale, too pale, her face twisted with pain, her long, dark hair hanging in messy tangles around her gaunt features. The blue of her dress was faded, as though it had been soaked in time and sorrow. She took a step forward, her hollow eyes locking onto mine with a gaze full of desperation. I should have been terrified, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. She was standing right in front of me now, just inches away, and yet she felt 1,000 miles away, trapped between worlds. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a low whisper echoed in my ears. "Help me." My heart raced, but I couldn't move. My body refused to listen to my mind, frozen in place, rooted to the floor. I tried to speak, but no words came. Then, Emily's eyes widened, and her lips parted in a grotesque scream, a sound so full of agony it made the walls shake and my bones rattle. The scream wasn't just a cry, it was the pure essence of her suffering, the unrelenting horror she had lived through. And when she screamed, it felt as if the very air around me thickened with pain. I staggered back, my breath ragged, my vision blurring. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. The room spun around me, my head pounding with an intensity that felt like it was going to split me in two. My chest constricted, as if an invisible force was crushing the life out of me. The agony intensified. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical. A sharp, searing pain lanced through my entire body, starting from my chest and spreading like fire to my limbs. I gasped, clutching at my ribs, feeling the hot pulse of torment seeping through my skin. My muscles seized, and I fell to my knees, unable to hold myself up any longer. Emily's form flickered, her face contorted in sorrow and rage, and the pain surged again, unbearable now, like 1,000 needles driving into my skin, twisting inside my bones. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The only sound I could hear was the shrieking wail that echoed in the room, her voice reverberating in my skull. And then, through the haze of excruciating pain, I saw something I wasn't prepared for. Her hands, cold, skeletal, reached out for me. Her fingers curled, her nails long and sharp, and I felt the ghostly touch against my skin, like ice water seeping into my veins. I tried to pull away, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the very touch of her was pulling me into some abyss, some void that threatened to swallow me whole. "Please." The word was more urgent this time, desperate, her voice now an anguished roar. "Help me." But there was no help for her. Not for Emily. And not for me. I felt my consciousness slipping, the edges of reality beginning to blur. It was as if I were slipping into some dark, endless pit, drowning in the cold, suffocating grip of the ghost's agony. I could feel her pain inside me, as if her torment had become mine. My body was racked with spasms, and I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth, but I hadn't bitten my tongue. The weight of her presence pushed harder, more violently. And then, for one terrible moment, I felt her claws sink deeper into my flesh, the pressure so intense that it was as if my very soul was being ripped from my body. In that instant, I finally understood. This was her curse. Her endless torment. And it wasn't just her ghost. It was them, the unseen forces that had tormented her, twisted her until she became a part of whatever dark power inhabited this place. I was feeling that curse now, and it would never let go. As the pain reached its peak, something inside me snapped. I had to break free. I had to survive. But just as the world around me began to spiral into darkness, a voice broke through my fog of agony. Run. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't the ghost. It was something else, something far darker, something far more dangerous. And I knew that whatever it was already waiting for me to make the wrong move. With every ounce of strength left in me, I fought back. I managed to wrench myself away from the ghost's grasp, collapsing onto the cold, hard floor. The scream of Emily echoed in my ears as I crawled, desperate, toward the door, toward any escape. But the apartment was closing in on me. It was no longer just Emily's ghost. It was the building itself, alive, hungry, and angry. I wasn't sure if I could make it out. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just her curse anymore. It was mine. I barely slept that night. The pain had subsided, but it left a lingering ache deep inside me, both physical and emotional. The ghost's touch, her unbearable scream, still echoed in my mind, replaying over and over. I felt broken, twisted by her torment, and yet, strangely, I also felt connected to her in a way I couldn't explain. Like our suffering was intertwined, like I could understand her pain in ways no one else could. I didn't know how long I lay there in the darkness, the weight of the apartment pressing down on me. The sobbing had returned, that pitiful sound, but now it felt different. It wasn't the agonizing wail from before. It was softer, more subdued, almost as if the ghost was no longer screaming out in rage. She was crying, pleading. I couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed something from me. But what? The thought gnawed at my mind all through the night, refusing to let me rest. Emily's ghost, what had I learned? What had I missed in my desperation to escape her fury? There had to be a reason for her torment. A reason for her presence in this apartment. I had to find it. I couldn't just run away anymore. Now I had seen the depth of her suffering. Now I had felt it firsthand. But how could I help her? I spent the next day poring over anything I could find about the history of the apartment, about the building itself. I scoured the internet for old newspaper articles, visited the library to look up records. I spoke with the neighbor again, trying to piece together every fragment of information. But no matter where I looked, I kept hitting dead ends. Until the thought hit me. What if the ghost was trapped? What if she wasn't just haunting the apartment because of unfinished business or an untold story? What if she was stuck? What if the thing that had tormented her, the entity that I had felt lurking behind her pain, had trapped her here? What if Emily wasn't just the victim, but the prisoner? The idea terrified me, but it made sense. Everything I had felt, every strange occurrence, seemed to suggest that she wasn't simply haunting the apartment, she was bound to it. Somehow, something had anchored her here, leaving her in a state of eternal suffering. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to face this head on. I had to find out what was keeping her here. What was holding her soul captive. I tried to piece together the events of her life, the things she had suffered before her death. It wasn't just the ghost who was in pain, it was something deeper, something more insidious that had tied her to this place. I couldn't help but wonder if it was the apartment itself, if the building had absorbed the suffering of its previous residents, feeding on their pain until it became something monstrous. Or maybe it was someone who had caused Emily harm and then cursed her to this place, leaving her to suffer for eternity. As I wandered through the apartment that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the walls themselves were alive with eyes. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the cracked windows felt as if the building was listening, waiting for me to make a move. It was as though I was on the edge of something, teetering on the brink of discovery. The answer was out there, somewhere, waiting for me to find it. Then, as if in response to my thoughts, the apartment shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, the lights flickered once, twice, and then, there it was. The faintest whisper, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. "Help me." It was Emily. Her voice again, but this time it was different. Softer. Less frantic, but still full of that same desperation. I stood still, listening, heart pounding in my chest. The sobbing had returned, but now it was quieter, almost as if she was drawing closer. She wasn't just a sound anymore, she was a presence. I felt her in the very air around me, the chill of her sorrow brushing against my skin. The locked door. I hadn't thought about it in days. But now, as if some invisible force was guiding me, I turned toward it. It felt inevitable, like I was being drawn to it. I knew now that I couldn't avoid it any longer. The key to setting Emily free, the key to understanding her, was beyond that door. I had to open it. As I approached, my hand trembling, I realized that I was no longer just unlocking a door. I was unlocking a part of the past, a part of Emily's history that had been buried for far too long. The door was the final barrier between me and the truth. I couldn't help her until I understood the truth of what had happened to her. And I couldn't escape until I had set her free. But deep down, I knew that opening that door would change everything. It would force me to confront the darkness, to face the truth, and to make a choice. Would I be strong enough to handle it? Or would I become another part of the story, another lost soul trapped in the apartment's curse? The moment of reckoning was fast approaching, and there was no turning back. I had never felt so close to the edge of something terrible, yet undeniably inevitable. Every step I took toward unlocking the mystery of Emily's torment felt like stepping deeper into the shadow of a nightmare. The apartment itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting, as if the entire building was anticipating the moment I would discover its darkest secret. I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that something was watching me, something more sinister than just the ghost of Emily. It was as if the building itself had grown aware of my pursuit, a malignant intelligence lurking behind every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights. The temperature was growing colder by the hour, and the air felt thick, oppressive. I sat in the dimly lit living room, surrounded by my notes, my findings. I had spent the entire day scouring every available record, piecing together fragments of Emily's life. And what I found didn't bring the peace I had hoped for, it only deepened the mystery. Emily was not just a victim of circumstance, she had been connected to something much darker. The first piece of the puzzle fell into place when I revisited the torn diary I had found behind the locked door. It was tattered, its pages worn with age, but I could still make out most of the writing. The entries were incoherent at times, filled with fragmented thoughts and ramblings, but they painted a clear picture when pieced together. The girl was terrified. Not just of someone, something. The words were cryptic, but it was clear that she was being hunted by something far more malevolent than any mere human. She spoke of shadows that moved on their own, whispers in the dark that made her skin crawl, and a growing sense of dread that followed her everywhere. But it wasn't just her, there were others in the building, people who had lived here before her, who had experienced similar things. Her fear wasn't isolated. It was shared. And then I found it. In one of the final entries, Emily wrote something that froze my blood. They promised me protection, but they were the ones who brought it here. It has taken everything from me. It is not just in the walls, it is in me. It won't let me go. I don't know how to stop it. I feel it growing stronger. I had no idea what she was referring to, but the sense of terror in her writing was palpable. It wasn't just her ghost that was trapped here. There was something else, something much darker, attached to her. That's why I remembered the neighbor's warning. She had spoken of others, other tenants who had suffered, others who had disappeared. I had dismissed it at first, assuming she was exaggerating or just trying to scare me. But now, the pieces were falling together. I grabbed my phone and searched for the building's history once more. I needed more answers. And this time, I was determined to dig deeper. The building had been standing for decades, and over the years, it had seen its share of tragic events. Fires, suicides, disappearances. It was as if the very ground beneath the building was soaked in sorrow and death. But one name stood out in the records, a name that seemed to haunt the history of the apartment more than any other. Ruth Turner. I had found her name once before, but it hadn't registered. Ruth Turner had been the previous tenant of the apartment Emily had moved into. But what was truly disturbing was the fact that Ruth Turner's name appeared in connection with several other unexplained deaths in the building. She was involved in occult practices. A witch, or at least, that's what the whispers said. I had dismissed it as superstition, but now, I wasn't so sure. Ruth Turner had been involved in something far darker than I could have imagined, and whatever it was, it had involved Emily. It had involved this apartment. A chilling thought struck me. What if Ruth Turner had summoned something evil, and bound it to this place, trapping it in the very walls? What if she had tried to use Emily, or perhaps even sacrificed her, to keep whatever she had summoned from escaping? And now, that entity was still here, lingering in the shadows, feeding on the pain and suffering of those who lived in this cursed apartment. The pieces were falling into place too quickly now. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach, a sense of inevitability washing over me. The malevolent presence I had felt all along, it wasn't just a ghost. It was something far worse. It was alive, and it had been here for decades. The ghost of Emily, her endless torment, wasn't just the result of a tragic death. She was bound to this place, trapped by Ruth Turner's dark rituals, forced to remain here for eternity unless I could find a way to break the curse. But breaking the curse wouldn't be easy. It would require confronting whatever dark force had been summoned, something so dangerous that Emily had spent her final days in fear of it. As I sat there, the room growing colder by the second, I realized that I was no longer just investigating a haunting. I was in the midst of something far more dangerous, a battle between light and dark, a battle for my soul. I had to make a choice. Would I continue down this path, searching for a way to free Emily, or would I walk away before I too became part of the curse? The answer seemed simple, but deep down, I knew that there was no turning back now. The evil in this apartment was calling to me, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to resist. But I had to try. For Emily. For myself. The truth was out there, waiting for me to find it. And once I did, I would have to make the hardest decision of all, how to destroy the entity that had enslaved Emily's soul, and whether I could survive it. The days blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I couldn't sleep without feeling the weight of the apartment pressing in on me, couldn't stay in the apartment without hearing the soft, insistent sobbing that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. The temperature continued to drop, and no matter what I did, no matter how I tried to distract myself, there was no escaping the chilling presence of Emily's ghost. But the worst part? The dreams. They had started innocently enough. The kind of dreams you push away in the morning, unable to remember their details but still haunted by a vague sense of dread. But now, they were different. The dreams weren't just fragments of thought, they were vivid, lucid, and terrifying. Every night, I fell deeper into a nightmare that felt too real to be a product of my mind. The world around me seemed to shift into something darker, a place where light barely reached, and the air felt thick with the weight of unspeakable things. Each time I closed my eyes, the same scene played out in my mind. It was Emily. She was sitting on the floor of her apartment, her back against the wall, her hands clutching her knees as she rocked back and forth, her face hidden behind a cascade of tangled hair. The room around her was dark, darker than any room should be, and the silence was suffocating. I could hear nothing but the sound of her quiet, desperate sobs echoing through the space. But then, the shadow moved. It was just a flicker at first, barely visible in the corner of my eye, but as my gaze shifted, I saw it more clearly. A figure, tall, imposing, and cloaked in darkness, loomed over Emily. It was faceless, yet I knew that it wasn't a person. It was something else, something malevolent. Its presence was suffocating, oppressive, and I could feel it closing in on Emily, devouring the very light in the room. I wanted to shout, to scream, to warn her, but no sound came from my mouth. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to stop the inevitable. Emily didn't see it at first, didn't seem to notice the growing darkness, but then she did. Her eyes, wide, filled with fear, darted around the room as though she could sense the presence of something she couldn't see, but she could feel it pressing on her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to stand, to run, but her limbs wouldn't obey her. She staggered, falling back against the wall as the darkness grew, swallowing the room inch by inch. And then came the voice. Low, guttural, and cold, it whispered through the thickening air. You cannot escape. It was the last thing Emily heard before she collapsed to the floor in terror. The shadow reached for her, and she screamed, but no sound left her lips. Her eyes met mine in that fleeting moment, eyes full of agony, pleading for help. But there was nothing I could do. Nothing. The shadow enveloped her, and in an instant, she was gone, swallowed by the darkness, her cries fading into silence. I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The dream felt too real, too vivid, as if I had somehow crossed into Emily's world, seen her final moments. The details were burned into my mind, the terror on her face, the suffocating presence of the shadow, the way she had tried to fight it but ultimately failed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it was a memory. Her memory. The final days of her life, relived in my mind as though I had experienced them myself. The darkness had consumed her, but it wasn't just the shadow that had taken her. It was something deeper, something tied to the building itself. The entity that had followed her, tormented her, and finally claimed her soul. And now, it wanted me. I stumbled out of bed, drenched in sweat, my mind reeling from what I had seen. The air felt heavy, thick with the lingering sensation of Emily's final moments. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The nightmare was still fresh, still vivid, and I knew now that I wasn't just dealing with a simple haunting. This was something else. Something far darker, far more powerful. The entity that had consumed Emily wasn't just bound to her, it was tied to the very fabric of this place. The apartment was its prison, but it was also its playground, a place where it could feed on the fear and pain of anyone who dared to live here. I had to know more. I had to understand what had happened to Emily to uncover the source of this evil before it consumed me as well. But as I sat there in the silence of the apartment, I realized something far more terrifying than the shadow itself. I had just witnessed the beginning of Emily's descent into darkness. The nightmare was just a glimpse of what she had gone through. And if I didn't act quickly, it would be my nightmare too. The question now wasn't whether I could survive. It was whether I could stop the thing that had claimed Emily, and whether I could face the darkness that was closing in on me. The air in the apartment felt thick, as if it had absorbed the darkness that lingered in the corners of the room, heavy with the weight of secrets and untold horrors. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was alive, that it was breathing, feeding on my fear, and every breath I took seemed to draw me further into its grip. After the nightmare, after seeing Emily's final moments, I knew I had to act. I had to try and communicate with the ghost, try to understand what it was that bound her to this place. Maybe if I could hear her story from her own lips, I could figure out how to free her, or at least put an end to whatever malevolent force was using her as a vessel for its terror. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The shadow in my dreams had been a warning, and it was growing stronger by the hour. I sat in the living room that night, surrounded by candles, trying to clear my mind. The air was colder than usual, and I wrapped myself in a blanket, but the chill seemed to seep through, settling deep into my bones. The sobbing, faint at first, began to echo through the apartment, growing louder, sharper, more insistent. Emily's cries had become a constant presence, but tonight they seemed different. There was something more desperate in them, as though she was pleading with me. "Emily?" I called softly into the dark, my voice trembling. The sobbing stopped for a moment, and for a brief second, I felt a flicker of hope. But then, the temperature plummeted, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, reaching toward me. The chill I felt earlier intensified, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I tried to steady my nerves, pushing aside the gnawing fear that clutched at my chest. "Please." "I'm trying to help you," I whispered, but my words felt hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. "I know you're scared. I can help you." For a moment, nothing happened. I felt foolish for thinking that anything could come from simply speaking to the air. But then, slowly, I heard the faintest rustling, a soft scuffing noise behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the emptiness. But then, there it was again. A whisper. "Help me, help me, you're the only one. Get out before it gets you." I froze. The voice was clear this time, but it wasn't just Emily's. It was distorted, like it was being spoken through a filter, laced with something darker, something twisted. The cold grew even sharper, and I could feel something press against my chest, pushing the air out of my lungs. I gasped for breath, but no matter how deep I inhaled, it wasn't enough. The suffocating weight of the room was closing in. "Leave, now," the voice rasped, this time unmistakably darker, as if a new presence had joined in, one that wasn't Emily. I stood up suddenly, backing away from the center of the room, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to get out. I had to leave. But I couldn't. I felt as though the walls themselves were holding me in, trapping me in this nightmare. My feet felt rooted to the floor, as though I had no control over my own body. I turned, desperate to escape, but the door to the hallway was no longer visible. It was just a wall, an endless stretch of dark, suffocating space. The apartment was twisting, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. And then I heard it, the shadow. A hiss, like the sound of something scraping against metal, echoed from the farthest corner of the room. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice wasn't Emily's anymore. It was low, guttural, filled with malice. I couldn't see the thing that was speaking, but I could feel it, a presence too dark to even comprehend, hovering just beyond the edge of my vision. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking beneath me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in front of me, visible now in clouds of mist. A distant, unnatural noise filled the room, a creaking, cracking sound like something large and heavy moving just out of sight. The apartment groaned, the walls bending under the weight of something unseen. Suddenly, the sobbing resumed, but this time it wasn't just the soft weeping of a girl in distress. The sobs were interspersed with a deep, menacing growl, a sound like nails scraping against stone. It was as though the apartment itself was being torn apart from within, and Emily was caught in the middle of it, her pain amplifying the wrath of whatever dark force had been awakened here. "You can't help her," the voice said, and this time it was accompanied by a sudden, violent gust of wind that rattled the windows. The candles flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. The force of it pushed me to the ground, my hands bracing against the floor, trying to keep my balance. I looked around in a panic. The shadows were moving, swirling in unnatural patterns, as though the very darkness had become alive, seeking to consume everything in its path. The room seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and the temperature continued to drop, my breath coming in sharp, visible clouds. "She is mine," the voice thundered, echoing around me. "And so are you." I felt a sharp pain shoot through my chest, like I was being stabbed from the inside. It took my breath away, leaving me gasping for air, my hands clutching at my shirt as if I could somehow hold onto my own body. The pain intensified, each breath feeling like it might be my last. I could feel the force of the entity pressing against me, its grip tightening, pulling me into the dark abyss that was consuming the room. I had tried to communicate with the ghost, but now I understood. It wasn't just a ghost of a girl trapped by some unfinished business, it was a force far darker than I had ever imagined. Whatever Emily had been involved in, whatever had followed her here, was alive. It was hunting me now. I was no longer in control. I was at its mercy. And just as I thought I would break under the pressure, the pain stopped abruptly. The room was silent. The temperature began to return to normal, and the shadows retreated, as if the entity had momentarily lost interest in me. But I knew better. It was only waiting. It wasn't finished with me yet. I tried to stand, my body trembling from the experience. I had to get out. I had to leave before it got worse, but a part of me knew that I could never escape the nightmare. Not anymore. The entity had marked me. The apartment had fallen into an eerie silence after the entity's violent outburst. The shadows, though still lingering in the far corners of the room, no longer moved with the same malicious intent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by something far older and more malevolent than anything I had ever encountered. The presence was still there, hiding in the dark spaces of the apartment, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. I sat on the edge of the couch, my heart still pounding from the terror I had just experienced. My hands trembled as I clutched the torn diary I had found in the abandoned room. The cryptic entries that had drawn me into this mess were now the only thing I had left to hold on to, my only chance at understanding the truth. But each page I turned seemed to reveal more questions than answers. The diary was filled with fragmented thoughts, broken sentences, and feverish scribbles, clearly written in a state of panic, as if the girl had been desperately trying to make sense of the torment she was enduring before it consumed her. I ran my fingers over the brittle pages, trying to decipher the words that had been left behind. The handwriting was shaky, as though it had been written in a frenzy. Many of the entries were incomprehensible, filled with scratched-out words and half-finished thoughts. But there was one entry that caught my eye, an underlined phrase that seemed to leap off the page. The door must remain closed. The ritual must be done at midnight, when the shadows are strongest. It is the only way. I frowned, my mind racing. The ritual? What ritual? The diary was full of references to a ritual, but the instructions were always incomplete, the sentences trailing off just before revealing something crucial. Each time the girl mentioned it, she wrote with urgency, but the details were impossible to make out fully. Another page turned, revealing more frantic scribbling. It has been here longer than me. The door was always locked. He will come. Only the ritual can bind him. But again, no details. No explanation of what he was, or what the ritual entailed. I tried to make sense of it all, but the more I read, the more disoriented I became. My head ached, as though the words themselves were working against me, trying to pull me deeper into the darkness that had already claimed the girl. I read on, my eyes darting over each line as I desperately searched for something more tangible. There had to be a clue, something that could help me understand what was happening, something that could lead me to the way out of this nightmare. Finally, near the last pages of the diary, a new entry caught my attention. The handwriting was more controlled now, less frantic, but the fear in the words was undeniable. I have seen him. He watches me from the other side of the door. He knows what I am trying to do. The ritual is the only way to send him back, but it's incomplete. I cannot finish it. The door, it must remain closed. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Who or what was this he? The girl had been tormented by something much more terrifying than just a simple ghost. This entity, the one that had tormented her, wasn't just some spirit trapped in a place it couldn't leave. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. And it was still here. It had been watching her, waiting for her to fail, and now it was waiting for me. But what was the ritual? What was I supposed to do with these incomplete, cryptic instructions? How was I supposed to stop something that had lived in this place long before Emily had arrived? And why had the girl been so terrified of the locked door? The last entry was the most puzzling. The shadows have taken over. The door will open, and when it does, I will be gone. Please, someone finish it before the darkness comes for us all. It felt like a warning, one I didn't fully understand yet, but one I couldn't ignore. The ritual was the key, but without the full instructions, it felt like I was chasing a shadow of a memory. It was as though Emily herself had been trying to finish it, but whatever had haunted her had twisted her mind, preventing her from completing the task. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ritual wasn't just a way to end the haunting. It felt like a binding, a way to trap something, him, and perhaps even the apartment itself. I had to finish it. I had to find the rest of the instructions before it was too late. But then, I heard it again, the sobbing. It wasn't distant this time. It was right behind me. My blood ran cold. I turned quickly, expecting to see Emily standing there, but the room was empty. The sobs were louder now, more frantic, and I realized with a sickening certainty that they were coming from within the walls themselves. Suddenly, the air grew thick with an unbearable pressure, and I felt as though the apartment was closing in around me, suffocating me. The shadows seemed to deepen, taking on forms, figures that loomed just beyond my sight. I could feel them, surrounding me, pressing in. The ritual. It was Emily's voice, But it was no longer a plea, it was a command. Her voice echoed in the room, reverberating through the walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of the terrifying vision that unfolded before me. I glanced down at the diary, clinging to the last shred of hope that it would tell me what to do next. The ritual had to be done. It had to be. But how could I perform it with the incomplete instructions? How could I stop the darkness that was growing stronger with every passing minute? Suddenly, I realized the door. The one Emily had warned me about. The locked door. It wasn't just a door. It was the gateway. And if I couldn't find a way to close it for good, I would be trapped here forever, just like she had been. I had no choice. The ritual had to be performed, and I had to finish it. But as I looked at the diary one last time, I understood that the answers I needed might be hidden somewhere I hadn't dared to look. The apartment itself was the key, and the locked door was the final puzzle I had to solve. It was time to face the darkness. The sobbing had stopped, but the weight of the apartment's presence still pressed down on me. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating almost. The darkness wasn't just in the corners of the room anymore, it was seeping into the very walls themselves, crawling beneath my skin, clawing at my mind. I could feel it watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. It wasn't just the ghost of Emily anymore, something darker, something far older, was awake. It was the thing behind the door, the entity that had tormented her, and that was now preparing to do the same to me. I stood in the middle of the living room, my hands still clutching the diary. My mind raced, heart pounding in my chest. The ritual. It was the only chance I had. But I had no idea how to perform it. The instructions were incomplete, the ritual cryptic. But Emily's last words in the diary were clear. The door must remain closed. The locked door. I had to finish what Emily started. But how? I glanced around the apartment, looking for anything that could help me. The furniture, the objects scattered around, none of them seemed important at first glance, but the diary had mentioned certain items. Ritualistic items. Things that could complete the ritual and stop whatever was on the other side of the door. The first item was simple: salt. Emily had mentioned it in one of the entries, written hastily as if she had run out of time. Salt will protect you. It will bind him in the place where he belongs. Salt? I could already feel the absurdity creeping in, but I couldn't ignore it. I had seen the salt shaker in the kitchen earlier. I hurried to the kitchen, grabbed the shaker, and poured a large pile onto the counter. I watched the white grains glisten in the dim light, trying to calm the storm of panic inside me. The next item was something even stranger: a mirror. A full-length mirror had stood in the corner of the living room when I moved in, covered by a dusty sheet. Emily had written about mirrors in the diary too, how they were a portal, how they reflected more than just your image. The mirror was a way to see the truth, to expose what the darkness wanted to hide. The ritual needed it, Emily had written, but only under the moonlight. I hesitated. The idea of a mirror in this place, with the entity watching me, filled me with dread. But there was no choice. I had to follow the steps, no matter how illogical they seemed. I pulled the sheet off the mirror, revealing the dusty glass beneath. The reflection that met my gaze sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just me looking back. There was something else there, something flickering in the depths of the glass. I couldn't focus on it. I had to ignore it, or it would consume me. Next, the diary had mentioned candles, black candles specifically. They were necessary for the ritual to create a boundary between the living and the dead, to channel the energy required to bind the entity. I didn't have any black candles. I didn't even know where to buy them in this neighborhood. But the entry had said something else too. Any candle will do if you cannot find black. The flame will burn away the shadows. I had white candles in a drawer by the kitchen, left over from some forgotten occasion. I grabbed them, setting them up in a circle around the mirror. Finally, the last item was something I couldn't quite understand at first. A personal item. Emily had written that it was essential, but she didn't say what kind of personal item it had to be. Something close, something that belonged to her, something that bound her to this world. I looked around the apartment, my gaze falling on the things I had gathered during my time here, the framed photograph from the previous tenants, the little figurines on the shelves, the books stacked haphazardly by the window. None of them felt right. But then I remembered something that had caught my eye the first night I arrived. It was an old locket, hidden in a drawer, buried under some papers. I didn't know why it had stood out to me then, but now I understood. It was the final piece. The locket was small, tarnished with age, but when I held it in my palm, I felt a strange warmth pulse from within it, as though it had a life of its own. I didn't question it. I placed the locket in the center of the circle of candles, next to the mirror. I stood back, surveying the setup. The apartment felt different now, more oppressive, more alive. The shadows seemed to stretch further, to creep closer to the center of the room. The sobbing had stopped, but the oppressive silence was somehow worse. I didn't know what would happen next. Would the ritual work? Or would I unleash something darker than I could even imagine? With a deep breath, I lit the first candle. The flame flickered to life, its light casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I lit the second, and then the third, watching the light grow, pushing the darkness back, but only slightly. There was no turning back now. I had no idea how to perform the ritual. I had no idea if I had everything I needed. But the only thing I could do now was move forward, or else I would be consumed by the very thing I was trying to stop. As I stared at the flickering flames, I could feel the presence of the entity growing stronger. I could almost hear its breath, its movement, as it waited. The door was still closed, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. And when it opened, everything would change. I held my breath, praying that the ritual would be enough to protect me. The room felt alive, vibrating with a quiet energy as I stood there, watching the flames of the candles flicker in the darkened space. The ritual had begun, but I didn't know exactly what I was supposed to do next. The diary had given me the basic instructions: light the candles, surround the mirror, and place the personal item in the center. But the rest of the steps were still unclear. There was a part of me that felt like I was performing some kind of strange, dangerous experiment, and with each breath, I could feel the weight of the decision settling over me. The apartment was eerily quiet for a moment, as though it was holding its breath. But the silence didn't last. I glanced nervously around the room, feeling the temperature drop again, the air growing thick with a cold, unnatural chill. The warmth of the candles seemed to do little to push back the ice creeping into the corners of the space. A low hum filled the room, like a faraway buzzing that grew louder with each passing second. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. The sobbing had returned, but it wasn't coming from anywhere specific. It seemed to reverberate through the walls, through the very floorboards, like it was coming from all directions at once. Then I felt it. A sensation, sharp and cold, like an icy hand had gripped the back of my neck. I spun around, expecting to see something, anything, but the room was empty. Yet, the weight in the air had shifted. Something was here with me now. something malevolent, its presence suffocating. I felt my heart pounding faster, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the shadows around me began to grow, stretching across the room in unnatural ways. I didn't understand it at first, but the darkness was alive. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was a force, something that seemed to pulse and writhe in the corners of the apartment. The mirror. I forced my gaze to the mirror, my throat tight with fear. The reflection seemed wrong. The room behind me, the one I knew so well, was distorted in the glass. The walls were warped, as though they were bending inward. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore, they had taken shape. Figures, tall, hunched shapes, loomed just out of view, flickering in the mirror's reflection. I took a trembling step back, but as I did, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It was as though something invisible had reached inside me and squeezed. I gasped, clutching at my shirt, feeling my pulse race. I tried to shake it off, but the pain only intensified. Then, the sobbing grew louder, closer. But it wasn't just the sound of crying anymore. It had changed. It was almost pleading, desperate. I turned to the locked door, its dark wood standing ominously against the wall. The door, the one I had been warned about. The one I had avoided. Now, I could feel it calling to me, pulling me toward it, like a magnet drawing me in against my will. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and I stumbled, my vision blurring. The room seemed to tilt, spinning around me. I reached out to steady myself against the wall, but the sensation of falling was overwhelming. It felt as though the ground was pulling me deeper into the apartment, into the darkness that was alive, feeding off my fear. In the mirror, I saw it again. The shadowy figures. This time, one of them stepped closer. I could see it more clearly now. Its shape was humanoid, but its features were obscured, wrapped in a haze of black smoke that swirled around it like a living thing. The shadow's hands stretched out, clawed fingers reaching toward me, as though it wanted to drag me into the mirror with it. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the shadow followed, its limbs elongating as it reached through the glass. The room seemed to distort further, and the pain in my chest intensified, now radiating through my entire body. My head spun as though my very thoughts were being ripped from me, pulled into the void that was opening before me. The candles flickered, their flames dancing wildly in the air, casting twisted shadows against the walls. The temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath now, white mist in the air, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by terror, my feet frozen to the floor. The shadow was getting closer, the room closing in around me, the suffocating darkness pressing harder against my skin. The sobbing, now mixed with screams, filled my ears, a chorus of anguish that drowned out everything else. The ritual. I had to finish it. I had to complete it, but my body wouldn't move. The pain was unbearable, my head pounding, my thoughts clouded with fear. And then, I saw her. In the reflection of the mirror, her face appeared, Emily's face, twisted in pain. Her eyes were wide, pleading. She looked just like the ghost I had seen before, but now she was trapped in the mirror, staring at me with desperation. Her mouth opened, and for the first time, I heard her clearly. "Please, help me, finish it." Her voice was distant, but the agony in it was undeniable. I couldn't move. I was locked in place, watching as the shadow loomed closer, stretching its claws toward me. The reflection in the mirror was no longer just a reflection, it was becoming real. The room around me blurred, the walls closing in. I could hear the scrape of something against the floor, something dragging, something heavy. And then, I knew. It was the ritual. The salt, the mirror, the locket, all of it had to be used in the right way, but I had to act quickly before I was consumed by the very darkness I was trying to banish. I reached for the locket in the center of the circle, feeling the icy chill crawl up my arm. As soon as my fingers closed around it, the room seemed to go completely still. The pain in my chest lessened slightly, but the shadows still swirled, circling me like vultures. The dark figure in the mirror was now directly in front of me, its eyes glowing with malice. I held the locket tightly, staring at Emily's reflection one last time, hoping, praying that I wasn't too late. I could feel the weight of the locket in my hand, cold and heavy, as though it were no longer just a simple piece of jewelry. The shadows in the room pulsed, like a living thing, pushing against me, closing in on all sides. I didn't know how much longer I could stand the pressure. My body trembled, the cold air gnawing at my skin, while the haunting sobbing turned into something darker, more insistent. Then, it happened. The shadow that had been lingering in the corner of the mirror moved, and in a single, jerking motion, it began to form. The darkness was shifting, twisting, becoming something tangible, something that should not exist in this world. The air thickened with dread, and for a moment, I could feel time slow. My breath caught in my throat as the figure became clearer, solidifying into a form, her form. It was Emily. At first, she appeared as a blur, her figure hazy and distant. But as the shadows retreated from around her, I could see her more clearly. Her face was pale, her dark hair matted to her face, and her eyes, those wide, pleading eyes, locked onto mine with a desperation that sent a chill down my spine. She was no longer just a shadow or a whisper in the air. She was real. Real and trapped. But there was something wrong, something darker in her presence now. The pain she had shown earlier was still there, but it was mixed with an overwhelming sense of urgency, as if she knew something I didn't. No, her voice was faint, but it cut through the tension like a blade, sending a shock through my chest. She was standing in the mirror now, just on the other side, her hands pressing against the glass as though she was struggling to reach me. "Don't complete it, please." Her words were strained, ragged, as though speaking was a struggle for her. I took a hesitant step forward, holding the locket tightly in my palm. My mind screamed at me to finish the ritual, to perform it exactly as it had been written in the diary. This was the only way to banish the darkness, to set Emily free, to end whatever curse haunted this apartment. But Emily, she was telling me not to. And her expression, her pain, her fear, it was more than I could ignore. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice growing more frantic. "It's not what you think. The ritual, it will only make it worse." I froze. The room felt colder, the shadows reaching farther, the walls seemingly closing in on me. The whispering sobs in the distance were louder now, more insistent, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Emily's form flickered again, the clarity of her image wavering like a reflection in a pond disturbed by wind. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the depth of her terror now, the way her face contorted as though she was in agony. It was as if she wanted to warn me, to save me from something I couldn't yet understand. "You think the ritual will save you?" Her voice cracked, her hands pressing harder against the mirror's surface, as if she were trying to push herself through to me. "But the thing that waits." Her words were cut off by a sharp, guttural sound, like nails scraping across glass. The shadow behind her writhed, pulling at her, clawing at her spirit. Emily's body jerked backward as though something invisible was dragging her away, pulling her back into the abyss from which she had emerged. Her terrified eyes locked onto mine for a final moment. "Please, don't open the door," she gasped, her words barely a whisper as her form dissolved, slipping back into the darkness. The mirror returned to its still, distorted state, her image vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me alone in the room with only the flickering candlelight and the deep, suffocating silence. The weight of her warning lingered in the air, a cold pressure pressing down on me from all sides. I stood frozen, heart racing. The locket still felt cold in my hand, but now it was heavier. I glanced at the locked door across the room, the one that had been the focal point of so many warnings. Was Emily's warning true? Was the ritual really the right way to free her? Or had I been blind to the truth all along? The air in the room had thickened again, and I could feel the malevolent presence swirling around me, tightening its grip. The shadows that had once been distant were now right beside me, their forms barely visible in the corner of my vision, constantly shifting. I could hear the sound of dragging footsteps, faint but unmistakable, moving closer and closer to me. The sobbing was louder now, so close it seemed to be coming from just behind me. It wasn't Emily anymore. It was something else, something darker. The cries were more animalistic, filled with rage and pain. The darkness in the room swirled violently, as though it was alive, trying to consume everything in its path. I was trapped. But I had to decide. Would I listen to Emily's warning, or would I finish the ritual and open the door, risking whatever horrors lay beyond? As the shadows stretched toward me, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever I chose, the consequences would be catastrophic. I stood there, the locket still clenched in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. The room had become a prison of shadows, each corner darker than the last, suffocating in their oppressive presence. The chilling air bit into my skin, and the faint sobbing had returned, now mixed with something else, whispers. They curled around my ears, incoherent and maddening. Emily's warning echoed in my mind, a desperate plea that I couldn't shake. Her form had disappeared, fading back into the abyss with her eyes full of terror. Don't complete it. It will only make it worse, she had said. Was she trying to protect me, or was she simply trying to keep me trapped in the same nightmare she had lived? Could I trust her? Or was she deceiving me, just another victim of the malevolent force that had haunted this apartment for so long? I glanced around the room. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows twisting with every movement, every breath I took. The air was thick with fear. I felt like I was suffocating, drowning in this suffocating pressure. And yet, I still held the locket. The ritual had been clear, its steps written in that old, brittle diary. Complete it, and Emily would be free. The darkness would end, and this apartment, this place, would return to normal. That's what I had believed, but now the very thought of finishing it made my skin crawl. What if Emily was right? What if completing the ritual wasn't the answer, but the beginning of something far worse? The sobbing grew louder, frantic, desperate. It wasn't the faint sound of a distant cry anymore. It was right there in the room with me, clawing at my mind. My pulse quickened. I could feel the temperature drop further, an icy chill seeping into my bones, making it difficult to even think clearly. No. I thought, my mind spinning. I can't open the door. But then, the voice in my head twisted. What if it's the only way? What if opening the door was the only chance to stop the haunting for good? The idea gripped me, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew it was dangerous. What if the ritual opened a gateway to something darker, something far beyond my understanding? A soft creak of the floorboards behind me made me spin around. My breath caught in my throat. The figure in the corner, the shadow that had been lurking, was growing, stretching unnaturally tall. It wasn't human. It had never been human. The darkness was alive, an ancient evil that had waited patiently, slowly feeding off the fear in the room. The air seemed to swirl around it, a cyclone of cold, suffocating energy. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed by the sight, the raw terror that gripped my chest. I glanced at the locked door again. I could still feel it, the pull. It was as if the door had its own power, its own will. It beckoned to me, urging me to finish what I had started. But if I opened it, what would I release? What had Emily been trying to tell me before she vanished back into the shadows? The sobbing had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that rumbled in the floor beneath me. The entity behind me, whatever it was getting closer. My feet were rooted to the spot, my legs shaking so violently that I felt like I would collapse. The whispers in the air were growing louder, clearer, like they were seeping into my mind, twisting my thoughts. The voice, the ghost's voice, was no longer just a whisper. It was inside me, in my head, growing louder with each passing second. Finish the ritual. The thought came again, louder this time. Open the door. Free her. Free yourself. But then, the words Emily had spoken flooded my mind again. It's not what you think. The ritual will only make it worse. My breath quickened. What if she was right? What if all of this, the shadows, the screaming, the terror, was only the beginning of something far more terrifying? I had no way of knowing what lay behind that door. No way of knowing whether I would be helping Emily or condemning myself to something worse. I looked at the mirror again. The reflection was distorted, shifting, as though it was pulling at the very fabric of reality. The figures in the glass had returned, but they weren't just shadowy outlines anymore. They had faces. Twisted, contorted faces, full of torment and rage. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes hollow and dark. The dark figure in the reflection moved closer, its hands reaching out through the glass, clawing toward me. The pain in my chest intensified. You can't fight it, the voice in my head whispered, chilling and insistent. You're too weak. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the maddening whispers, but they only grew louder, more insistent. The shadows were closing in, creeping along the floor and walls, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. I was running out of time. But in that moment of panic, something clicked. A thought, a feeling, a gut instinct. I can't do this. I couldn't finish the ritual. Not like this. I couldn't open the door and risk releasing whatever was trapped behind it. The fear, the pain, the darkness, it was all growing stronger with every moment I hesitated, but the alternative was far worse. My mind was racing. I had to find another way. A way to stop the entity, to free Emily without unleashing something far more dangerous. The ritual might not be the answer. It might be what kept the entity alive, what had allowed it to latch onto Emily's soul. With a final, shuddering breath, I let go of the locket. It fell from my hand, landing with a soft thud on the floor. The room fell silent, save for the distant sound of my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't going to complete the ritual. I had to find another way. But first, I had to survive this. The air in the room became suffocating, thick with malevolence. The temperature dropped even further, so cold it felt like ice was creeping beneath my skin, burrowing deep into my bones. The shadows that had once been distant and fragmented were now concentrated, swirling around the room like a storm. The very walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, vibrating under the weight of something ancient and vengeful. I could feel it. It was here. The entity. Suddenly, a burst of movement exploded from the corner of the room. A shadow rushed toward me with a speed that defied logic, and I instinctively staggered back, my body desperate to escape the impending collision. But it was too late. A force like nothing I had ever felt hit me, sending me sprawling to the floor. It was as if the air itself had turned solid, slamming into me with the fury of 1,000 storms. I gasped, pain flaring through my chest, the breath knocked out of me as the shadows seemed to coil around my body, constricting like a vice. I managed to look up, but it was only to see the ghost of Emily, her form now twisted and distorted. Her face was unrecognizable, her once pale features stretched in a grotesque grimace of rage and anguish. Her eyes, hollow and black, burned with an intense hatred, and I could feel her fury cutting through the air. Her figure was not soft and pleading anymore. She had become something else, something far more dangerous. "Leave," she screamed, her voice no longer the whisper I had heard before. It was a guttural roar, filled with pain and fury, echoing in every corner of the room. "Leave. Now!" The force of her scream knocked me back, my head slamming against the floor. Stars exploded in my vision, and for a brief moment, everything spun. But before I could gather my bearings, I felt it, the weight of her presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. The shadows shifted again, growing darker and more intense, wrapping around me like chains, pulling me into the very heart of the storm. I tried to stand, but my legs betrayed me, shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't breathe. The pain in my chest was unbearable, and I could feel something sharp digging into my skin. When I looked down, I saw dark, shadowy tendrils emerging from the floor, wrapping around my arms and legs like invisible hands, pulling me toward the center of the room. They were like the ghost's fingers, latching onto me, tightening with each passing second. I gasped for air, my throat burning, but all I could hear was the sound of Emily's tortured scream, now mixed with another voice, one that sounded deep, guttural, and ancient. It was a low growl, vibrating through the floorboards, like a predator stalking its prey. "It's not her," I realized, my mind spinning with panic. "It's something else. Something worse." The shadows pulled tighter, the pressure in my chest intensifying as the darkness seemed to swallow the light. My vision blurred as I struggled against the weight, trying to break free, but I couldn't. I was drowning in it. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped, my voice barely audible as the shadows twisted around me. Emily's form flickered, her face distorting further as she leaned toward me, her hollow eyes full of rage. "Because you don't understand. You don't know what you've unleashed." Suddenly, a sharp pain ripped through my side. I gasped, my vision swimming. When I looked down, I saw dark, blackened marks spreading across my skin like burns, the tendrils of the ghost's rage searing into me. It felt like fire, but colder than ice. I screamed, my hands fumbling to grasp at my side, but the pain was unbearable. The shadows tightened their hold, pulling me further into the storm. I need to escape. I need to get out of here. The realization hit me like a wave of clarity. I had been so focused on the ritual, on trying to help Emily, that I hadn't considered the possibility that this entire apartment, the darkness within it, was not just haunting her. It was consuming her. And now, it was trying to consume me too. With all the strength I could muster, I slammed my fist into the floor, desperate to break free. I reached for the locket, still lying there, untouched, but before I could grab it, a sharp pain shot through my wrist. The tendrils of darkness twisted tighter, pulling me closer to the epicenter of the storm. In that moment of sheer terror, something shifted. The room grew colder, colder than it had ever been. I felt the temperature drop to a level that was almost unbearable, so much so that I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The air became thick, suffocating, as though the very oxygen was being sucked out of the room. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could feel myself fading, my body giving way to the overwhelming sensation of being trapped. And then, in a flash of agony, everything stopped. The tendrils released me, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. My skin burned with the marks left by the ghost's grip, but I was alive. Barely. I could barely lift my head, but I saw Emily's form flicker one last time. Her face, filled with hatred and sorrow, was distorted beyond recognition. "You should have left," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now I will claim you, just as it claimed me." Her figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the sound of the apartment's walls groaning, as though the building itself were alive, angry. I lay there, shivering, blood dripping from my side, as the room seemed to settle back into a suffocating silence. The darkness was still there, pressing in from all sides, and the cold lingered in the air, biting into my skin. But for a moment, there was no more sobbing, no more screams. I was alone. But for how long? The entity wasn't gone. It had merely taken a step back. And now, I had no choice but to face it. I lay on the cold floor, my body bruised and battered from the violent confrontation, my breath shallow, each inhale a painful reminder of the terror I had just faced. The room was still. The shadows seemed to have receded, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. I could hear the faintest sound, like a distant whisper, tickling the edges of my mind. The sobbing had stopped, but its echo still lingered in the silence. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. If I had somehow invoked something far worse than Emily had ever been. But the image of her, her twisted, anguished face, flickered in my mind again. She hadn't been warning me to stop, she had been begging me to end it, to free her, to stop the entity from consuming both her and anyone else who came too close. I looked at the locket. It lay on the floor just out of reach, as though daring me to finish what I had started. The ritual hadn't been completed yet. I knew that. The steps had been clear, and I had come this far. But the question burned in my mind, was it too late to turn back? The marks on my skin still throbbed, a constant reminder of how close I had come to being consumed. The darkness wasn't gone. I could feel it, still lurking in the corners of the apartment, pulling in my thoughts, urging me to finish the ritual. "Just complete it," it whispered. "Finish it and you will be free." But the question haunted me, what was I releasing? Was Emily truly a victim, or was there something darker behind her torment? I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I had to make my decision. With trembling hands, I reached for the locket. The moment my fingers closed around it, the temperature dropped again. A biting cold washed over me, seeping into my very soul. The whispers grew louder until they became a cacophony, echoing in my ears, drowning out all reason. I stood, legs unsteady, and moved toward the center of the room. The circle of candles I had carefully arranged, the last step in the ritual, flickered in the low light. I could feel the weight of the apartment's presence pressing against me, pushing me to finish. I took a deep breath and placed the locket into the center of the circle. The moment it touched the floor, the apartment seemed to shudder. The shadows flickered, dancing violently along the walls. The temperature plummeted. My breath turned to mist before my eyes, and the faint sobbing returned, this time louder, more frantic, as if it were coming from everywhere. Then, a scream. Not from Emily. Not from the ghost. This scream was raw, inhuman, a scream that rattled the very foundation of the apartment. It vibrated through the walls, shaking the ground beneath my feet. My ears rang with the sound, and I staggered back, trying to hold onto my sanity as the walls seemed to close in around me. The floor beneath me cracked, the sound sharp and jagged, as though the very structure of the building was breaking apart. Then, something massive stirred in the darkness, something ancient, something far worse than anything I had ever imagined. It was as if the room itself was alive, pulsing with malice, with rage. The locket in the center of the circle began to glow, its light a sickly green that bathed the room in an eerie glow. I tried to step back, but my feet were frozen to the floor. The air was thick, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward me, hungry and eager. And then, I saw it. A figure appeared in the center of the room. Not Emily, but something much darker. A towering, shadowy form with no face, only a void where its eyes should have been. Its presence was suffocating, overwhelming. The air around it crackled with energy, the temperature dropping so low that I could feel my fingers go numb. The entity was not a ghost. It was something older, something evil, pure evil. The room seemed to warp around it, reality itself bending in its presence. And in its voice, I heard the truth. "You should never have come here," it hissed, its voice like the scraping of nails on stone. "You are nothing but a pawn in my game. You were never meant to save her. You were meant to free me." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Emily hadn't been the victim. She had been the prisoner. The ritual I had completed hadn't freed her. It had opened a door, a gateway, for this thing to escape. I tried to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The entity's dark tendrils reached toward me, wrapping around my body, pulling me closer. I felt the cold seeping deeper into my bones, felt my strength draining away. It was feeding off my fear, my terror. It was stronger than I ever imagined. "You think you've completed the ritual," the entity sneered. "But you've only unleashed the true power of this place. The ritual wasn't to free the girl, it was to give me a vessel, a way to escape." I looked around, panic swelling in my chest as the walls seemed to close in tighter. The apartment, which had once seemed like a normal place, now felt like a tomb, a prison for this ancient malevolent being. I had unknowingly played my part in its release. The room twisted and shifted as the entity's form grew larger, more solid, until I could see its shape more clearly, its twisted limbs, its gaping maw, its inky blackness seeping into every crack, every corner. "You are mine now," it growled, its voice reverberating in the air. I had made a terrible mistake. I had thought I was saving Emily. I had thought the ritual would free her, but in the end, it only served to unleash the true horror, something that would never leave. The apartment was its prison, and now, so was I. As the darkness closed in around me, I realized too late there was no escaping now. The ritual had been a trap, and I had walked right into it. I was no longer just a witness. I had become part of the haunting, and there was no going back. The room was silent. Not the kind of peaceful silence you'd expect after a storm, but a suffocating, unnatural quiet. The air hung heavy, thick with the weight of everything that had just happened. The entity, the shadows, the tormented ghost of Emily, everything was gone. Or so it seemed. I stood motionless in the center of the room, my body aching from the violent confrontation, the cold still seeping into my bones. The locket lay in the middle of the circle, now dim and lifeless, no longer glowing with that sickly green light. The walls, which had once felt alive with malevolent energy, were still. The floor no longer cracked with the echoes of the entity's presence. It was as if the apartment had exhaled, releasing the pressure that had been building for weeks. Yet, something didn't feel right. The ghost of Emily had vanished. The screaming, the sobbing, the terrifying force that had haunted me for so long, all of it had stopped. The apartment was eerily quiet, but it was a silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Something else. I turned slowly, scanning the room, trying to shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. But the space was exactly as it had been before, the old, dusty furniture, the cracked walls, the faint smell of mildew in the air. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. The weight in my chest grew heavier, a gnawing feeling deep in my gut. I could still feel it, the presence. The lingering something. It wasn't physical, but it was undeniable, like the apartment itself had absorbed all the darkness and terror and was holding onto it just beneath the surface. Waiting. Watching. My breath came in shallow bursts, my hands trembling as I walked toward the window. I opened it wide, hoping the cool night air might offer some relief, might push away the sense of being watched. But all I could see was the sprawling city beneath me, the same bustling streets, the same lights twinkling in the distance. There was nothing out of the ordinary. But that feeling, the presence, lingered like a shadow in the corner of my mind, refusing to leave. It was as if the apartment itself had become a vessel for something darker, something that had been waiting for years, perhaps even centuries, for the right moment to break free. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my racing heart. "It's over," I whispered to myself, though the words felt hollow. "It's finally over." But I knew deep down that it wasn't. The apartment might have fallen silent, but I had learned the hard way that silence didn't always mean peace. Sometimes, silence was just the calm before the storm. When I opened my eyes, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room, a flicker of movement, something dark shifting just beyond my vision. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Only the shadows, stretching long across the floor, twisted and unfamiliar. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. My mind was racing, grasping at straws, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. Could it be possible? Was I just imagining it? Was the lingering presence I felt a figment of my paranoid mind, a last vestige of the terror that had consumed me? I didn't know, but I couldn't ignore it. The apartment had been a prison for something ancient and evil. I had freed it, or so I thought. And in doing so, I had brought something with me. It had attached itself to me, to this place, to the very walls. It was still here, somewhere in the space around me, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. I took a step back, my hand brushing against the locket still lying on the floor. It had stopped glowing, but something about it felt wrong. There was a chill to it now, a heaviness, as if it had absorbed everything that had happened in this room. It was just a trinket, a small, insignificant thing, but in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that it held more than just memories. It held the echoes of everything that had occurred, of everything that had almost been unleashed. And then, as I stared at the locket, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled once more. The shadows, those same twisted, stretching shadows, seemed to move again, just slightly, as if reacting to my presence. I blinked, but they didn't go away. They lingered, waiting for me to look away, for me to doubt what I was seeing. But I didn't look away. I couldn't. The faint sobbing returned, just on the edge of my hearing. Soft, mournful, like a ghostly lullaby. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the realization crash down on me. It wasn't over. Not yet. The apartment was silent, but the presence remained. It was still here, somewhere, just beneath the surface, biding its time. And no matter how far I tried to run, no matter how much I wanted to leave, I would never truly be free. This place, this haunting apartment, had marked me. And as much as I tried to push it all out of my mind, I couldn't escape the fact that I had become part of its story. The apartment had claimed me, just as it had claimed Emily. And now, it was waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Days passed. The physical wounds, the bruises, the cuts, the burns began to fade, as if the apartment had been kind enough to let me recover. My body was healing, the pain subsiding, the swelling retreating. I almost felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I went through the motions of everyday life, work, errands, even trying to sleep. But each time I closed my eyes, the nightmares came rushing back, vivid and unrelenting. It wasn't just the memories of the ghost, of Emily's pleading face, or the entity's twisted form that haunted me. It was the sense of presence that had latched onto my mind, gnawing at my sanity. My mind had become a battleground between reality and the horrors I'd faced. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, as if the apartment was still there with me, its shadows creeping into every corner of my room. Each time I tried to shake it off, the sobbing would echo in my mind, a constant reminder of what I had experienced. The worst part was that I couldn't trust my own senses anymore. I'd be walking down the street, and for a moment, a shadow would flicker in my peripheral vision. A figure, no, hey, feeling, would be there, and I'd freeze, my breath hitching in my chest. But when I turned, there was nothing. Only the empty, ordinary street. My therapist said it was a form of post-traumatic stress. He chalked it up to the stress of the breakup, the haunting experience, the ritual, everything blending together into a perfect storm of anxiety. But as the days passed, I began to wonder if it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. What if the apartment had left a permanent mark on me? What if the trauma wasn't just psychological? I visited the apartment again. The building loomed in front of me, just as ordinary as it had been before, but the memories rushed back the moment I crossed the threshold. The elevator creaked in its old track, and the hallways seemed longer than I remembered, darker, somehow. The air felt thick with the weight of everything that had happened there, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the fear. I stood in front of my door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I hadn't been back since the ritual. The idea of stepping inside, even just for a moment, made my stomach churn. But I had to know, had to face it. I was terrified of what I might find, but I couldn't let the apartment win. I couldn't let it control my life. When I opened the door, the familiar creak of the hinges seemed deafening. The apartment was still there, unchanged. The furniture, the dust, the quiet. Everything was exactly the same. But something was different. I could feel it. The silence was too heavy, too suffocating. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, just out of sight, like the apartment itself was aware of me. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my breath catch as I glanced around the room. It was the same as it had been, empty, neglected, but somehow more sinister now. The locket that had been at the center of the ritual was still there, on the floor where I had left it. But it wasn't just lying there, inert as it had been before. No, now it seemed alive. There was a faint, unnatural glow coming from it, flickering like the dying embers of a long-extinguished fire. I knelt down and reached for it, my hand trembling. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, a shock of ice-cold electricity jolted through my body. I pulled my hand away, my heart racing as I looked at the locket. It wasn't just a relic of the past, it was still connected to everything that had happened here, to the entity, to the girl, to the haunting. A sudden pain shot through my chest, and I gasped, feeling as if something was crushing the air from my lungs. The sobbing began again, distant but unmistakable. The same soft, desperate sound that had tormented me for weeks. It was louder now, almost as if it were in the next room. No, it was inside me. It rattled my ribs, crawled under my skin. I could hear it even when my ears were silent. I stumbled backward, slamming into the wall. The apartment seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the familiar terror. The shadows stretched toward me, and the lights flickered overhead. Not again, I thought. Please, not again. I forced myself to leave, my heart hammering in my chest as I fled out of the apartment, out of the building. My breath came in sharp gasps, my legs weak, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get away. I needed to escape the apartment, to escape that thing, that presence that was still lingering, clinging to me like a disease. But when I stepped outside, the city was no better. The streets were just as empty as the apartment had been. The noise of traffic, the chatter of people, it all felt distant, unreal, as if I were standing in a dream. I looked around, feeling the cold air against my skin, and realized that I couldn't escape. It was everywhere. It wasn't just the apartment. It was inside me. The scars weren't just physical. They were something deeper, something that had been etched into my soul. The entity, Emily, the rituals, it had all changed me. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to heal, I could feel it there, watching, waiting. The sobbing still echoed in my mind. The shadows still stretched behind me. And though the physical wounds had healed, the scars remained, etched deep into my mind, a permanent reminder that some things, some horrors, never truly leave. They stay with you, festering in the dark corners of your mind, until one day, they pull you back into the nightmare. A few weeks had passed since my last visit to the apartment, but the haunting never truly left. It wasn't just the nightmares or the constant feeling of being watched, it was the people around me. Friends, coworkers, even strangers I interacted with seemed to be affected by the same dark presence that had tormented me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity wasn't fully destroyed, that somehow it had found a way to extend its reach beyond the apartment. At first, it was small things, things I tried to ignore. A friend, Rachel, had started calling me late at night, her voice shaky, asking if I was all right. She didn't seem to have a reason for calling, just that she felt something was wrong. At first, I brushed it off as concern for me after everything I'd gone through. But the more she called, the more I realized something was wrong. One night, she asked if I had been to the apartment recently. The way she asked, it wasn't just curiosity. There was fear in her voice. She told me she had been having nightmares about the place. About a woman, a girl, her face twisted in terror, begging her for help. And then she told me something that made my blood run cold. Rachel had seen a shadow, a figure, standing in her hallway in the middle of the night. She couldn't explain it, but it was there, just watching her, before it disappeared. I told her I'd been through the same thing. The haunting. The ghost. I tried to reassure her that it was over, that it was done with. But Rachel wasn't convinced. Neither was I. Something inside me told me that whatever I had done to try and stop the entity had only fragmented it, shattered it into pieces, allowing it to seep out into the world like a poison. The next incident came a few days later when my coworker, Tom, approached me at the office. He seemed distant, distracted, not his usual self. He told me that he had been staying at a hotel downtown, and on the second night there, he had woken up to a cold chill in the air. The room, he said, had felt wrong, like the very air was thick with something. But the most disturbing thing? He swore he had heard faint sobbing coming from the hallway, just outside his door. I stared at him, my heart pounding. I had never mentioned the ghost, not to anyone but Rachel, but Tom's story sounded far too familiar. He described it exactly, the coldness, the sobbing, the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond his perception. I tried to laugh it off. "It's probably just your imagination," I said. "Hotels are creepy sometimes. You were probably just exhausted." But deep down, I knew better. The entity had a way of attaching itself to people, of spreading its influence like a sickness. Then there was my neighbor, Mrs. Green. She was a kind, elderly woman who had lived across the hall from me for years, someone I had occasionally shared a cup of tea with. She had always been a little quirky, but lately, her behavior had been off. One afternoon, I saw her standing in the hallway, staring at my door with a blank expression, as though in a trance. When I approached her, she blinked rapidly, as though waking from a daze, and apologized for standing there so long. That night, she came knocking at my door. Her hands were shaking, her face pale. She told me she couldn't sleep. "There's something wrong with the building," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder as though afraid someone, or something, was listening. "I can feel it. It's in the walls, the floors. I hear it at night. It's like the building's alive, Alex. It's alive and it's watching." My heart sank. I tried to comfort her, but inside, I felt a sickening certainty. It was happening. The entity, the thing that had plagued me, was now reaching out to others. It wasn't just confined to the apartment anymore. It was leaking into the lives of everyone connected to me, everyone who had even brushed against its dark influence. That night, I went to bed uneasy, unable to escape the gnawing fear that I had somehow failed to destroy it. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The apartment building felt alive, just like Mrs. Green had said. I could feel its presence in every corner, like the walls themselves were pulsing with dark energy. I thought I was imagining it, but the next morning, I woke up to something I couldn't ignore. My phone was buzzing on the nightstand. A message from Rachel. "It's back." I saw it again, the shadow. "It's been following me. I think it wants me, Alex." I froze. My blood ran cold. Rachel's message echoed in my mind, a warning that I should have heeded sooner. The entity wasn't just confined to the apartment. It was following us, spreading from one person to the next, like a contagion. And I had no idea how to stop it. I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity had been born in that apartment, but now it was becoming something much darker, much more powerful. It had learned how to spread, how to latch onto anyone connected to the place, to me, to Rachel, to Tom, to Mrs. Green. The nightmares had returned. But now, they weren't just my own. Now, they were reaching out, and they were coming for all of us. I thought moving out would be the end of it, the final step in escaping the suffocating presence that had consumed my life. But as the days passed, I realized I had been wrong. I hadn't left it behind. The ghost wasn't confined to the apartment. It had attached itself to me, and no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape its grasp. I packed my things and found a new place, a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, just a temporary refuge, but it was far enough from the building, far enough from the memories of Emily and the entity that had haunted me. Or so I thought. The first night in my new apartment, I tried to ignore the sense of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. I convinced myself it was just the stress of the move, the upheaval of my life. I unpacked the last of my boxes, made a cup of tea, and settled on the couch, trying to relax. But something was wrong. The air felt too still, too heavy. Every little sound seemed amplified in the silence, the hum of the refrigerator, the rustling of the curtains, the creak of the floorboards. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I woke up to the sound of faint sobbing. I shot upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moon outside the window. I listened, holding my breath. The sobbing was distant, just like it had been before. But this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway or the apartment next door. It was coming from inside my room. I turned my head, my eyes scanning the shadows. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was unmistakable. Soft, desperate sobs, like a girl in pain, calling for help. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to believe it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was imagining it. But the sobbing grew louder, more intense, and I couldn't deny it any longer. I shot out of bed and turned on the light, but the sobs didn't stop. They echoed in the room, filling the space, wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just the remnants of my trauma, the after effects of everything I had been through. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't just in my head. The ghost had followed me. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and fear. I couldn't concentrate at work. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Emily's face, twisted in terror, would flash before me. The sobbing continued, always at night, sometimes in the corner of my room, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes just behind me when I thought I was alone. I started seeing things. Shadows flitting just out of the corner of my vision. Objects moving on their own, just slightly at first, a book tilting on a shelf, a chair scraping across the floor when there was no wind. But soon it escalated. I would wake up to find things had been rearranged in my apartment, my keys moved, the lights flickering, a glass of water tipped over as if someone had been there, watching me. And always, that sense of cold, that oppressive weight, pressing down on me, reminding me that I was never truly alone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my mind, still haunted by what I'd been through. Maybe I hadn't fully processed everything. But then, one night, I saw something I couldn't explain. I was sitting on my couch, reading, trying to distract myself from the fear that was creeping back into my life. The sobbing had faded into the background, but the unease had never left. My eyes kept darting to the shadows in the corners of the room, to the space near the window where the moonlight barely reached. It was then that I saw it, just a flicker at first, a shape in the darkness. A shadow, tall and thin, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the figure moved, silently, toward me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to respond. The shadow didn't have a face, just an outline, a silhouette of something wrong. It seemed to float just above the ground, like it wasn't quite part of the reality around it. Then, the sobbing started again, louder, closer, like it was coming from right behind me. I turned slowly, my heart racing, to face the sound. But there was nothing. The room was empty. I was alone, but the terror didn't stop. The presence was there, in the air, pressing against me. The figure in the doorway was gone, but I knew it hadn't left. It was still here, still following me, lurking just out of sight, just beyond my reach. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep pretending that the ghost wasn't real, that it was just my imagination. It was here, with me, no matter where I went. I had thought that moving would be enough, that I could escape. But I had been wrong. The apartment wasn't just a building. It was a doorway, a connection, and the entity had found a way to follow me. I wasn't just haunted by memories anymore. I was haunted by something alive, something that could move, that could reach out and touch the world around me, no matter where I went. It was in the walls. It was in the shadows. And it wasn't going anywhere. The days dragged on in a haze of fear and confusion. Each time I thought I had outrun the nightmare, it came back, stronger, more insistent. I couldn't sleep without hearing the sobbing, the soft, pitiful cries of the girl, so close I could almost feel her breath on my neck. Every corner of my new apartment seemed to hide something, something I couldn't see but knew was there, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself I could fight it, that I could outrun the ghost, but deep down, I knew the truth. There was nowhere left to run. No place that was safe. The entity had become a part of me. No matter where I went, it would follow. It had already claimed its new target, me. I could feel it in the air, every time I entered a room. A heaviness that settled into my chest, making it hard to breathe. A chill that crept into my bones, sinking deeper with every passing second. I was no longer just haunted. I was being hunted. It was in the way the world started to warp around me, in the way I began to feel like I was losing myself, my sense of time and place. The shadows didn't just move anymore, they stared. The whispers of the ghost weren't just in my dreams, they were in my waking moments too. The reflection of my own face in mirrors seemed off. It looked wrong, like I was someone else entirely. I tried to reach out for help, but the few people I spoke to seemed disconnected, as though they were slipping away from reality themselves. Rachel's phone calls became more frantic, her voice trembling every time she spoke to me. "It's not over, Alex. It's here. It's with me too." But it wasn't her anymore, not completely. She was slipping, just like the others, and I couldn't help her. I couldn't help myself. The real turning point came one evening while I was sitting alone in my apartment, trying to ignore the rising panic that seemed to close in on me. I heard a soft knock on the door, 3 slow taps, each one echoing in the stillness. I didn't even get up to check. I knew what it was, who it was. When I opened the door, I wasn't surprised to see her. Emily. The girl. She stood in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear, her hands outstretched as though she were reaching for me. Her face was gaunt, pale, twisted in a mask of desperation. The sobs came from her, louder now, not just crying but begging, pleading. "Help me," she whispered, her voice broken, the words scraping my soul. I froze. This wasn't right. She wasn't asking for help, she was demanding it. I should have slammed the door. I should have screamed, should have run, but instead, I stepped back, my legs trembling. I let her in. I didn't even know why. As she crossed the threshold, the apartment felt colder. The air grew thicker, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. I could barely breathe. The sobbing grew louder until it was a shrill wail that seemed to tear through my mind, echoing in every corner. And then, I realized something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't Emily who was standing in front of me. It was the entity. The ghost had taken her form and made me believe it was her. It was no longer just a girl, a lost soul. It was hunting me, taking shape, feeding on my fear. All the twisted things it had shown me, the shadowy figures, the whispers, the coldness, it wasn't her anymore. It was it. I tried to run, but the moment I turned, the door slammed shut with a force that knocked me to the floor. I scrambled to my feet, but the room seemed to close in around me, the walls moving, the shadows pulling me in. I could feel it now, its cold fingers brushing against my skin, tugging at my very soul. And that's when I realized the terrible truth. I had never truly escaped. I had never even left the apartment behind. The ghost didn't need to be confined to that building, it could follow me wherever I went. It was in me now. The curse was mine. I was the new target, the new source of its torment. I had become a part of its story, just as Emily had. The girl had never been the one trapped. I was. The sobbing wasn't her plea for help. It was the entity's warning. It had found its next victim. And now, there was no escape for either of us. The ghost didn't need a body. It didn't need a face. It didn't need anything but fear. And now, I was the one who would scream in agony, just like she had before me. The apartment had never really been just a place. It was a prison. And now, I was locked inside. I was its prisoner. Forever. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.